Chapter 437. Yi Shiwen entered the competition space for the third round. His opponent had already arrived there and was waiting for him. However, Yi Shiwen became surprised as soon as he saw his opponent. He couldn't help but smile since he was familiar with this man. This man was Li Fei. He also belonged to the Yi Yuan school. He was one of the disciples who had been taken away from the Yi Yuan school back then. Yi Shiwen hadn't seen him in last 10 years. He had already entered at Legendry's great, complete realm. Moreover, he had fought all the way to the third round. There used to be some enmity between him and Yi Shiwen in the past. However, Yi Shiwen had never paid much attention to him. Perhaps it could be said that Li Fei didn't pose any threat to him. Li Fei had been in the true martial university for many years. However, he and Yi Shiwen could be regarded as peers of the same generation. He was the descendant of a former disciple of the true martial university. He was born and raised in the true martial university. However, he was only considered an unofficial personnel of the true martial university at that time. He had been officially enrolled as a disciple of the true martial university when the university had officially started to recruit disciples. There was an intrinsic difference between an unofficial personnel and an authentic disciple of the true martial university. Li Fei was also surprised to see Yi Shiwen. He forced a faint smile on his face. He hadn't anticipated that he would come across a calamity star, like Yi Shiwen in the third round. He and Yi Shiwen had faced off in small skirmishes in the past. He had wanted to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen in the past. However, such thoughts had disappeared from his mind once Yi Shiwen had gradually risen to fame like a rising star. One would become very jealous if the opposite party turned out to be a bit more ferocious. However, one would leave the thought of fighting altogether if the opposite party turned out to be far more ferocious. This was Li Fei's current way of thinking. He knew that he and Yi Shiwen weren't on the same level from the beginning. He couldn't compare himself with Yi Shiwen even in the wildest of his thoughts. "Brother Yi, I confess that I'm not your match. Therefore I surrender." Li Fei didn't wait for Yi Shiwen to speak anything and spoke up first. He was a bit bigger than Yi Shiwen in stature. However, Yi Shiwen was far powerful than him. They were of the same generation. So, only their strengths could make a difference. Yi Shiwen gawked for a moment. He hadn't anticipated that his opponent would admit defeat so straightforwardly. A whole new level of respect emerged inside Yi Shiwen's heart for him after this. True Martial University's Yi Shiwen is the winner of this fight. The voice of the referee elder reverberated throughout this space. The first day of the tournament finally came to an end along with the completion of the third round. Yi Shiwen, Xueyan Luo, and the others went to the Metropolis Martial City. It was situated under the Metropolis Martial Peak. It was the core peak among all the peaks of the true martial university. In fact, the Metropolis Martial City was the capital city of the true martial university. So it was the most bustling city of all. Even the Hidden Star City undoubtedly differed by quite a margin from the Metropolis Martial City. The disciples of different inheritances and every major force had lodged in the Metropolis Martial City. They had already booked their places long ago. It would be a lot better if they stayed here since they would be able to leave for Metropolis Martial Peak for tomorrow's competition with convenience. Yi Shiwen had booked the biggest restaurant of the Metropolis Martial City. He had invited Xueyan Luo, Huang Luoqin, and the other disciples of the Yi Yuan school for a dinner party. Qi Fifan hadn't participated in this time's competition. However, Yi Shiwen had asked him to come as well for this rare get-together. Yi Shiwen escorted them to a private room in the restaurant. Each of them acquired their seats. Not many disciples of the Yi Yuan school were there in true martial university. Therefore, one private room was big enough to accommodate them all. Even then, there was a lot of space to spare. Today, it's a rare opportunity for our get-together. So, I raise a toast to everyone. Yi Shiwen raised a toast and spoke up. "Brother Yi, we've had several parties. Only you didn't have the time. Chi Fei Fan teased Yi Shiwen and said he felt a bit relieved to see that Yi Shiwen wasn't in a deep sorrow. Yeah, yes. The other people also began to boo in agreement. Everyone joined up after Chi Fifan took the initiative to tease Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if they had returned to their old days in the Yuan school. It no longer felt like the true martial university. There was a difference of heaven and earth between the two. They weren't very familiar with each other in the Yuan school. However, they looked very close to each other in this foreign land of the true martial university. This was the best restaurant in the metropolis martial city. The delicacies served here were like treasures. They were very delicious and extraordinary. The atmosphere gradually turned ardent as everyone's cups interlocked in cheers. Everyone ate and drank to their heart's content. Suddenly, they heard a burst of noises coming from downstairs. Everyone sent out their divine senses one after another to have a look. A special kind of matrix barrier was established inside this private room. So, the divine senses of the people couldn't come inside the room from outside. However, people inside this room could send their divine senses outside. Everyone was surprised to see a middle-aged man standing downstairs. He was clad in a scholar's robe and looked like a storyteller. He had walked inside the restaurant. So, several disciples who were present in the restaurant had surrounded him. Everyone's eyebrows immediately wrinkled up. He looked like an ordinary scholar of legendary realm. However, nobody dared to look down on him because they knew about his background. He had a mysterious origin. He belonged to the all-knowing scholars. Nobody knew when the all-knowing scholars had appeared in this world. They just knew that these people had been around for a very long time. They could be often seen in the tea houses and restaurants of various regions. These storytellers belonged to an organization known as All-Knowing Scholars. They possessed the most perfect knowledge of the entire world. There was hardly any matter that they didn't know. So, one could obtain any information as long as one had sufficient money to pay. Nobody dared to look down on these people or bully them even though they were physically very weak. This was simply because people didn't wish to face the retaliation of an organization like the All-Knowing Scholar. Many powerhouses had owed them favors over the years. Such an unseen yet accumulated soft power was sufficient to make a force disappear. So, one could well imagine the tyranny of the all-knowing scholar. Not many people knew the origins of the all-knowing scholar. However, they understood that the more they would know, the scarier it would get. Therefore, nobody dared to investigate too much about them or overstep the boundary. Even Yi Shiwen was very interested in their organization. He wanted to know how such a big organization functioned from the shadows. However, he was merely interested, nothing more. Of course, not all storytellers belonged to this organization. Everyone knew that the all-knowing scholar was an enormous force. How else would they be able to obtain the kind of information which other big forces couldn't? Everyone knew that it was a very big organization and had many branches. However, the all-knowing scholar had never projected itself on a large scale. In fact, a place like the Yuan school didn't even have a real all-knowing scholar. It only had some subordinate who operated in that area as storytellers. There was only one real branch of all-knowing scholar, even in a place like the true martial university. And it was in charge of handling the information network of the true martial university. In fact, nobody knew how many informants worked for the all-knowing scholar. Many people would say that the all-knowing scholar alone had sufficient amount of informants to maintain a smooth and unhindered flow of information throughout the intelligence network. There were many legends about the all-knowing scholar. Yi Shiwen also knew some of those. They had never participated in any disputes among different regions of the true martial world. They were merely responsible for selling information. And they could give all kinds of information as long as one could pay them the corresponding price. These storytellers were the subordinates of the all-knowing scholar. However, most of the people referred to each storyteller as all-knowing scholar. Anyway, they didn't have any names of their own. The major forces were quite wary of the all-knowing scholar. However, they had turned a blind eye to their operation since they hadn't heard of them participating in any kind of dispute or chaos over the years. The all-knowing scholar had become very popular, especially now during the competition. They had information on every disciple. In fact, they had circulated most of the information about the disciples. The completion of the first 3 rounds had ended. So, many disciples were asking for the information about their tomorrow's opponents from the all-knowing scholar. Most people were trying every means to inquire who would be their opponents in tomorrow's fight. The only exception was Yi Shiwen, because he possessed extraordinary self-confidence. People wanted to find out their opponent's identity. So, they could then follow the so-called saying of know yourself and know your enemies, and collect data on their opponents. Yi Shiwen wasn't arrogant. He was just self-confident. 3 rounds would take place tomorrow as well. He might as well look for a block of tofu and bang his head on it to kill himself if he couldn't even cross the first 6 rounds. The all-knowing scholar would hear people's queries and would then take out jade sheets from his spatial ring. The information that these disciples were seeking was written on those sheets. There was a whole bundle of information. There was so much information that even Yi Shiwen could barely see all of it. Yi Shiwen noticed that Shuiyan Luo, Huang Luoqin, and other disciples who had fights tomorrow were somewhat excited. After all, neither of them possessed incredible self-confidence like Yi Shiwen did, nor could they stay calm like Qi Fifan since he hadn't participated. They wanted to go down and buy the information which they needed from the all-knowing scholar. They didn't need to know about their opponents in tomorrow's fight, but they would find out if they asked that all-knowing scholar. After all, it wasn't a random competition. It had certain rules. Therefore, it would save them a lot of trouble if they knew things beforehand. Everyone was about to go down and purchase the information from the all-knowing scholar when they suddenly saw 2 tall figures march in. They were the Xian Yuan twin stars, one on the left and the other on the right, and the 2 of them arrived before the all-knowing scholar. They looked at him disdainfully. Aren't they the Xian Yuan twin stars? What are they doing here? Why do they wish to obtain information? Who can withstand their joint attacks? They don't need any information, do they? They obviously don't pay attention to ordinary people. However, what if the opposite party is a Heaven's Pride expert? Haven't you heard that these 2 were looking to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen today? Perhaps they wished to know specific information about Yi Shiwen. You don't say. These Heaven's Pride experts haven't competed against each other yet. Therefore, it's very hard to know who's stronger. So, it's quite normal if they are a bit cautious. The disciples of each force made some guesses. The all-knowing scholar raised his eyes to see. His expression remained unchanged as he indifferently asked, "What kind of information do you wish?" "We want intel on a person." The Xian Yuan twin stars replied in unison. It seemed as if their minds were linked or something. "Who's?" all-knowing scholar asked. "East Sea's Emperor Chen." The twin stars replied together, "We are only concerned about him among the disciples who have arrived here this time. Others are mediocre." The complexions of the disciples of the East Seas, Muddy Sky Island didn't change. However, the complexions of the disciples of the true Martial University and the Fire Cloud Cave had turned ugly as they heard this. Their faces had turned red since their Heaven's Pride experts had been looked down on. To be continued. Chapter 438. Xian Yuan twin stars had been arrogant and domineering since the beginning. They had arrived here a few days ago. So, it hadn't been very long, but they had already become very popular. Moreover, it was visible to everyone that they were arrogant and despotic. They considered everyone to be beneath themselves. Arrogant, domineering. Not many people had known about these 2 brothers in the past. However, everyone would obviously become familiar with these Xian Yuan twin stars after this event. Yi Shiwen clearly sensed several bad auras locking on to these 2 brothers while they were speaking. One among them was a man clad in common clothes. He was seated upstairs. He was emitting extravagance from his body. Another man was seated opposite to this man. He was clad in an aqua blue robe. He appeared a bit devilish. Yi Shiwen swept out his divine sense. That man clad in ordinary clothes possessed an overbearing, imposing aura, like that of a conqueror. He was none other than Emperor Qin. So, the other man who was clad in aqua blue robe ought to be the infamous sea demon Jin Wushuang. The Twin Stars brothers hadn't spoken loudly, however, who among the spectators didn't possess excellent martial power. It doesn't matter how low their voices had been. They couldn't have eluded the outstanding vigilance of the surrounding people. Gee, it seems like these two individuals have come from a domain where you're famous. The sea demon Jin Wushuang laughed mischievously. He looked towards Emperor Qin and spoke. They should have come to you directly. What do you say? These two are arrogant fools, that's all. Emperor Qin replied indifferently. You are more arrogant than these two, you know. Jin Wushuang spoke up without a trace of politeness in his voice. Perhaps nobody can surpass you when it comes to being arrogant. I'm confident. Emperor Qin replied. Nobody can be my match unless they are a sage expert. Saying that you aren't arrogant reflects how arrogant you really are. Jin Wushuang quietly said. He sensed Yi Shiwen's divine sense sweeping toward them at this time. He merely snorted, and the resultant vibration dispersed Yi Shiwen's divine sense. However, Yi Shiwen didn't mind his divine sense being dispersed since he wasn't being stealthy in the first place. His focus now shifted downstairs on that all-knowing scholar. The all-knowing scholar read out the entirety of the gathered information on Emperor Qin as per the request made by the Twin Stars brothers. Emperor Qin's information soon appeared in front of Yi Shiwen's eyes. Emperor Qin's origin was a mystery. Nobody knew about his background. Nobody knew which force he had taken birth in. They only knew that he was first seen in the southeastern region. He had become even more famous after he had participated in a battle in the Demon Island. Emperor Qin didn't join the true martial university like most other experts of the southeastern region at the time when every major force opened their gates for new disciples. He joined the Muddy Sky Island on the contrary. Then, a reputed elder of the Muddy Sky Island took him as his apprentice. However, this wasn't the end of his magnificence. Emperor Qin was genuinely valiant. He has already killed 4 Heaven's Pride experts. Nobody in the East Sea region dares to mess with him, the all-knowing scholar insipidly said. 4 Heaven's Pride experts. Everyone gasped. They hadn't anticipated that Emperor Qin would turn out to be so powerful. He had killed 4 Heaven's Pride experts, not 4 ants. The death of a Heaven's Pride expert was a big thing, and he had killed 4. One could well imagine the tyranny of Emperor Qin's strength. The complexions of the Xian Yuan twin stars somewhat changed. They were already quite wary of Emperor Qin. However, they couldn't help but gasp for breath when they heard this. Everyone suddenly understood. It was no longer surprising why these arrogant and domineering Xian Yuan twin stars didn't dare to underestimate Emperor Qin. They had no choice but to inquire about his strength in advance. 2 among those 4 Heaven's Pride-level experts had launched a joint sneak attack on Emperor Qin. However, he killed the both of them. The all-knowing scholar read out even more surprising information on Emperor Qin this time. It had been a 2 against 1. However, Emperor Qin had still managed to get rid of them. Countless people went in shock after they heard this information. It wasn't difficult for a Heaven's Pride expert to deal with another Heaven's Pride experts in a 1 versus 1 situation. After all, some of these Heaven's Pride experts were stronger than the others. So, it was completely understandable if he had defeated 2 experts who were weaker than himself. All kinds of unexpected things happen in a so-called fight between experts. One must make good use of every moment in a fight. A mere move might make a huge difference and can create a disparity of cloud and mud. So, killing 4 individuals wouldn't have been a big thing. However, the situation would be completely different if it were to be 2 against 1, and that too in an ambush. Such an incident clearly meant that Emperor Qin possessed more strength than most of heaven's pride experts of this generation. This information had left everyone to gasp in admiration. The troubled complexions of the twin star brothers had turned ashen when they had heard this information. Wasn't this like a slap in the face of these two? The news about these two brothers fighting as a tag team was well known in the entire world. The prospect of facing these two at once was akin to courting death for an ordinary Heaven's Pride expert. However, 2 Heaven's Pride experts had ambushed Emperor Chen in unison, and he had still managed to kill them. This information had made these brothers extremely afraid. Twin Stars brothers' biggest advantage was the fact that they fought as a tag team. Both of them were qualified enough to be ranked as a Heaven's Pride expert in their own individual merit. So, these 2 individuals working as a team should be considered as invincible as far as the younger generation was concerned. However, Emperor Qin had single-handedly achieved the same feat that these 2 individuals had notched as a team. This realization had to make them vigilant against him. Several experts went in shock as the all-knowing scholar read out that information. They had also become alert. After all, such a powerful expert was participating in this competition. He was a Heaven's Pride expert, like many others, but the gap between him and the others would slowly widen with time, to the extent that he might grow into a super expert who shakes the entire true martial world one day. Meanwhile, the rest of them would only climb up to the great sage realm. However, the difference between him and them would be like the gap between heaven and earth. However, that was a matter of the future. Even the Legendaries realm and semi-sage realm were good enough for many people at present. After all, they had just set foot on the right track of martial arts practice. But such a big gap had appeared between him and them straight after they had entered the right track, and that too within such a short period of time. Who would be able to restrain him in the future? This was also the main reason why every big force wanted to strangle the top geniuses of the other forces in the cradle. The main reason for such plots was the emergence of experts like Emperor Qin. One might not be able to sense any danger from such experts in the initial days. However, everyone would see the sheer price they would have to pay for allowing such an expert to mature fully once they had grown up. And then they would have to live in the shadow of such experts for thousands of years. History proves that 10,000 mediocre experts can't play the great role played by a true genius. But the ashen complexions of the Xian Yuan twin stars didn't last long, and restored to the normal arrogant appearance as they spoke up, "Humph! A team of ordinary experts can't be compared to our team." These twin brothers had excellent coordination and mutual understanding. So, their tag team obviously couldn't be compared with the collaboration of 2 ordinary Heaven's Pride experts. In fact, 2 Heaven's Pride experts would be a burden on each other if they didn't have mutual understanding, and they wouldn't be able to display their maximum power. However, they had no choice but to admit the fact that Emperor Chen was indeed a formidable opponent. "I wish to know the information on Yi Shiwen. Do you have it?" A deep and coarse voice came through the gate at this time. Everyone was surprised to see a tall figure. He was approximately 10 feet tall. He looked like a young, giant-like barbarian as he came striding in. He carried an imposing aura on his body. In fact, his aura was so compelling that it kept the other people away from him. He looked like the slumbering king of the beasts. Qi Tian. He's Fire Cloud, Caves, Qi Tian. Why has he arrived here? He must have heard that the all-knowing scholar has arrived here. That's why he rushed over. However, why is he asking for information on Yi Shiwen? What kind of enmity do these 2 men have? God knows. The matters of these Heaven's Pride experts are very complicated. Moreover, these Heaven's Pride experts are quite strange. Only God knows of their reasons. Brother Yi, this Qi Tian should be a good opponent for you. Qi Fifan frowned and spoke up. His body is extremely tough. He was ranked as a heaven's pride expert owing to his body. He possesses unfathomable strength and follows the same path as you. Yi Shiwen nodded. He wouldn't be anxious if it were an expert like Pang Yongbo. However, an expert like Qi Tian could be very difficult to handle. Yi Shiwen himself possessed the same kind of intrepid body. So he obviously knew how ferocious such an expert could be. Such experts could cause exceptionally awful injuries if they got the opportunity to come close to one's body. Moreover, Yi Shiwen's realm was still beneath his by 2 levels. This was Yi Shiwen's weak point. 1000 Primary Spirit Dawn. The all-knowing scholar replied without looking up. Qi Tian's robust body was in front of him. However, it didn't have any effect on him. It seemed as if Qi Tian's beastly aura hadn't caused any impact on him. Here, take it. I want all the information. Qi Tian threw a sack full of primary spirit dawn towards the all-knowing scholar and said. Yi Shiwen took a sip of wine. The corners of his mouth slightly shook. He didn't know how all-knowing scholar would evaluate him. He wasn't clear how much this all-knowing scholar organization knew about him, but they might have gone to the depths of his matters and may possess all the information. Yi Shiwen was very afraid of this all-pervasive organization. Yi Shiwen was born in the Yiyuan school. It is located in the Great Yu State of Southeastern region. This school is situated in the lap of the Qingfeng Mountain. He used to be an ordinary disciple 10 years ago. Yi Shiwen's history was gradually dug out from the mouth of the all-knowing scholar. This caused a huge sensation among countless listeners. They become even more surprised as compared to when they had heard about Emperor Qin. They were surprised because Yi Shiwen was merely at the 3rd stage of the Hotian realm 10 years ago, as per the information the all-knowing scholar was giving out. And everyone had been completely taken aback by this. They knew that Yi Shiwen's growth speed had always been very quick from the beginning, but they figured that it was only expected of a heaven's pride expert. However, they realized that he had witnessed a skyrocketing rise as they listened to the all-knowing scholar's information. Most heaven's pride experts had already entered the truth realm 10 years, at the very least. This obviously excluded that little rascal Pang Yongbo. He was young and had started late like Emperor Qin. However, he had entered the truth realm 10 years ago, even so. However, Yi Shiwen used to be a mere expert of the Hotian realm at that time. Hotian realm was a long-gone history for all the experts here. They had long forgotten about this realm. It was a several decades old matter, or might be several hundred years old matter for some. Even the most nitpicking individual here had no choice but to admit that Yi Shiwen's progress speed was exceptionally quick. Yi Shiwen was different from a top genius like Pang Yongbo, who had become a center of attraction since childhood. There had been no difference between Yi Shiwen and an average person 10 years ago. So he had surely risen so sharply because of some fortuitous adventure. However, what kind of a fortuitous adventure must that have been? To be continued. Chapter 439. Several people were still struggling to figure out what kind of a fortuitous adventure Yi Shiwen must have met with that had helped him become a Heaven's Pride level expert from an ordinary Hotian expert in mere 10 years. Yi Shiwen should have reached the peak of the Hotian realm in these 10 years if his cultivation had been good. He could have reached Xiantian realm at best. In fact, that would have been considered a huge achievement. However, Yi Shiwen's current strength was far more tyrannical than a Xiantian expert. In fact, there was no limit to his tyranny. Yi Shiwen must have obtained some astonishing inheritance, as per the guess of the all-knowing scholar. Yi Shiwen curled up the corners of his mouth. It seemed like the all-knowing scholar wasn't omniscient after all. He had been anxious that the all-knowing scholar might reveal the entirety of his secrets. However, it suddenly seemed like his fears were baseless in reality. I wish to know what kind of physique Yi Shiwen possesses. I also wish to know about his bloodline. Does he possess the blood of some ancient devil or god? Chi Tian asked in a more direct manner. He was mostly concerned about these things. He had also made some inquiries before he had come here. Only he and Yi Shiwen used same method of body strengthening among all heaven's pride experts. They both possessed tyrannical physique and invincible bodies. Therefore, he mostly cared about this information. However, he hadn't been able to get sufficient information on Yi Shiwen's physique until now. After all, no such information had been openly available so far. The spectators held their breaths. They also wanted to know how many disciples with special blood had risen to surface. After all, it was hard to tell how many disciples with special blood had appeared in the history of the true Martial University. But people recognized the bloodline quite quickly whenever one such disciple did appear. They would even find the respective allusion regarding that particular disciple's bloodline. People with special blood had been appearing for generations. So, it wasn't a rare occurrence. And it wasn't hard to find the corresponding records. However, there was no information on what kind of blood Yi Shiwen possessed for some reason. So, nobody knew what kind of blood and physique he possessed. However, there was a possibility that his bloodline might not be from some world-shaking inheritance. He possesses an ordinary body, the all-knowing scholar insipidly replied. He doesn't possess any special blood. What? How's it possible? Chi Tian's eyes turned wide open as he shouted. His beastly, imposing aura overflowed and swept towards the all-knowing scholar, as if to crush him. You're lying to me. Many spectators also went in shock. They couldn't believe this, especially the disciples of the true Martial University. They had personally witnessed the entirety of Yi Shiwen's expedition to this date, particularly that battle with the Titan body. It had been a dreadful collision between two top-notch individuals with extraordinary physiques. That fight had genuinely been earth-shattering. They had seen with their own eyes that Yi Shiwen hadn't fallen into a disadvantageous position while facing the Titan body. That Titan body's death would be futile if Yi Shiwen genuinely possessed an ordinary body. I'm not lying. He has an ordinary body, the all-knowing scholar replied indifferently. It seemed as if Chi Tian's imposing aura had no influence on him. I suspect he practices a very ancient body-tempering technique, the tyrant body technique. These words shocked everyone. Even Yi Shiwen was so startled that he stood up. He hadn't anticipated that they had investigated about his tyrant body technique. He had never made any mention to anyone about the power techniques he had practiced. Then Yi Shiwen sat down again. He didn't find it strange after he had given it a thought. After all, he had obtained the tyrant body technique from an auction. So, it shouldn't be surprising if someone knew about it. Tyrant body technique? What kind of a power technique is this? How come I've never heard about such a power technique that simply goes against the heaven's will? And how has he practiced it to such an extent that he's able to contend against those with special physique? There's indeed such kind of power technique. It was made in the ancient mythological era. Some mighty ancestor had created this world-shaking power technique so that they could rival the devils and gods. However, we anticipated that these were mere legends. We hadn't expected to see it with our own eyes. A power technique, like the tyrant body technique, was even rarer than the special physiques. This revelation made people even more terrified. This is a very high-handed power technique. Yi Shiwen had once snatched it from the hands of a clan at an auction house. The all-knowing scholar added with a calm look in his eyes. Suddenly, several people began to think. Yi Shiwen had snatched this power technique from the hands of a clan. This meant that could they do the same? They believed that they should be able to get hold of this power technique with their strength and with the backing of their forces. And they would advance by leaps and bounds if they got hold of it. After all, this invincible power technique could help one temper one's body to contend against gods and devils. The all-knowing scholar sensed everyone's greed. So he sneered and added, the tyrant body technique had only one layer at that time according to the information we possess. and it was only suited for a Hotian expert. There were no further layers. We speculate that he mended the entire power technique by himself as time progressed. The all-knowing scholar had shocked everyone even further. It wouldn't sound strange if he had said that Yi Shiwen had obtained this power technique from some clan, after all, who didn't come across adventures. The only difference was that Yi Shiwen's adventure had gone against the heavens, well, since it was revealed that he had mended this entire power technique on his own. This was actually him going against the heavens' will. What kind of incredible talent did he possess that had helped him in mending an entire power technique, and that too a technique which went against the heavens' will? One must know that the ancient sages possessed world-shaking skills in the mythological ages, and they would use these skills to create such power techniques. These techniques were mighty enough to slaughter even the gods and devils. The understanding of the world principles used to be on a whole different level in those times. The ancients knew enough about life and the universe to be able to comprehend the martial arts to such astonishing proportions. So, it wasn't strange for them to be able to create such world-shaking power techniques. However, Yi Shiwen was very young at the moment. He had been cultivating only for a few years, and was merely at the semi-sage realm. However, he had secretly mended an entire power technique without letting other people know about it. This was indeed the definition of going against the heaven's will. Even Qi Fifan, Shuiyan Luo, and the others who were sitting beside Yi Shiwen couldn't help but look at him. However, they didn't expect him to lay out any explanation. In fact, there was nothing to explain. But they were exceptionally amazed to see the reach of the information network of the all-knowing scholar. The all-knowing scholar had lived up to its name. They had inquired about a lot of stuff on Yi Shiwen bearing the top-secret info. Therefore, everyone was terrified to see the reach of the hidden tentacles of this organization. The most terrifying thing wasn't their ability to gather the information. The most terrifying thing was that anyone could get information on their enemies if they wanted to, as long as they had enough money to pay. This fact was so dreadful that Yi Shiwen already had an urge to destroy the entire, all-knowing scholar, even though he had barely heard the secret information about himself. It wasn't surprising that many forces were afraid of the existence of the all-knowing scholar. They didn't dare to stand against the all-knowing scholar organization, but it was the mutual enemy of all the forces. The forces of the true martial world had joined hands to besiege and annihilate the all-knowing scholar in the past. However, they weren't able to succeed. In fact, they had to face the counterattack of the all-knowing scholar thereafter, and they had to suffer heavy losses as a result. They eventually had no choice but to angrily approve of the existence of the all-knowing scholar. How's this possible? Qi Tian couldn't believe this. People with special physiques are invincible. This has been said for millions of years. It was indeed somewhat of an exaggeration and wasn't an absolute truth. However, this notion about the special physique had acquired the minds of the people of the true martial world. So, they believed that people with special physique were extremely formidable. However, they had now heard that Yi Shiwen had fully mended a power technique, which could contend against gods and devils on his own. Moreover, he had then practiced it enough to be able to compete with those who possessed special physiques. This whole action was in defiance of the natural order. Nobody would have believed this if it had been said by a bully. However, these were the words of the all-knowing scholar, and everyone knew that 99% of the information of the all-knowing scholar was correct. They wouldn't reveal any information without verifying it first. Even this news had been revealed after verification. Nobody had the guts to exchange fake information with the all-knowing scholar for making a profit because such courageous people were already dead. Even the complexions of those arrogant twin-star brothers had turned serious by now. They hadn't taken any note of Yi Shiwen in the past. They didn't care even if he had killed Fan Ming. After all, Fan Ming was merely their subordinate. So, Yi Shiwen had merely defeated one of their subordinates. This wasn't enough to make them afraid. Moreover, They had never even considered that someone could deal with their joint attack. They had only been a bit cautious of Emperor Qin, and they had only wanted to get information on Emperor Qin because of their slightly cautious nature. They weren't afraid of him in reality. However, they felt that they might have overlooked a very thorny person after they listened to these things about Yi Shiwen. It wasn't like their morale and courage had been shattered by this. However, the feeling that not everything was in their control annoyed them very much. Ha 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 ha. Qi Tian broke into a mad laughter. This is interesting. This is very interesting. I think everyone here is somewhat effeminate. I had no idea about such a man's existence. A real man faces his opponent head-on. That's how a clash between two tough men should take place. They must engage in a hand-to-hand combat. Yi Shiwen curled up the corners of his mouth. He was almost unable to control his laughter. This Qi Tian was more interesting than he had expected. The twin star brothers were standing beside Qi Tian, but they looked rather restless all of a sudden. Was he referring to them when he had said effeminate? However, they became speechless and their bodies went numb when they saw Qi Tian's 10 feet tall stature. You muscle brains should go and fight hand-to-hand with a monster. We are civilized people. The twin star brothers weren't the only ones who looked restless. Everyone present there was in the same state as them, apart from Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if they would explode with anger at any moment now. This is so funny. Who can be my Qi Tian's opponent here? Qi Tian's facial expression was calm as he spoke up, but his scary aura swept across wantonly like a ferocious tiger coming down from a mountain and scared everyone off. Everyone realized that this tall man was extremely aggressive and ferocious. He considered everyone beneath him. This guy was incomparably domineering. Could it be that none of the Heaven's Pride experts were a match for him? And perhaps Yi Shiwen was the only one who could match him? The twin star brothers began to feel very bad when they saw his proud expression. As the wolf cub had once said, arrogant people mostly dislike the ones who are more arrogant than them. To be continued. Chapter 440. This was especially true for the powerful and arrogant guys. Each of these Heaven's Pride experts was more insolent than the other. No one was modest and prudent. However, it's also true that they wouldn't have practiced to this extent if they were to be modest and prudent by nature. Most fortuitous adventures come to happen in dangerous places. A prudent person wouldn't take such risks. Hence, they wouldn't come across many fortuitous adventures. So their strengths wouldn't advance by leaps and bounds in a short time. This represents the so-called saying, one can obtain anything if one prefers to lead a leisurely and risk-free life. The Xian Yuan twin stars shot an unpleasant glance at Qi Tian. The killing intention was hardly concealed in their eyes. What are you looking at? Sissy boys, I am talking to you. Qi Tian stared back at them. There was no trace of politeness in his voice as he said, It's not allowed for us to engage in a fight outside the arena. Many of the spectators couldn't help but burst into laughter. He had actually said that. Qi Tian had said it, but not in a vague manner so one could let it pass. He had actually stated it as a direct attack. The twin star brothers certainly looked more delicate and fairer than Qi Tian. In fact, their fair skin made them look like two effeminate boys. The faces of the twin star brothers turned blue at first, and then white. Yet, they couldn't dare to start a fight here. Otherwise, they would give a valid reason to the experts of the true Martial University who had been waiting for a chance to get rid of them. Humph! The twin star brothers merely snorted and didn't start a fight. You continue speaking. Qi Tian asked the scholar to continue. The all-knowing scholar continued when he saw that both the parties had stopped quarreling. He told Yi Shiwen's entire biography. He told about everything in detail, apart from the ones which only Yi Shiwen had witnessed. Some of these things were mere speculations. However, they had basically touched upon the important details of Yi Shiwen's life. Yi Shiwen was also deeply moved. The all-knowing scholar was indeed an enormous force. Even he himself had overlooked several things. However, the all-knowing scholar had secretly inferred them. This organization was seriously very dangerous. It was advantageous as well as disadvantageous. The advantage was that you could effortlessly buy another individual's information anywhere and anytime. And the disadvantage was that the other people could also buy your information anytime and anywhere. Everyone gasped in admiration after they heard about Yi Shiwen's past. This was a thing of concern. Yi Shiwen might cause trouble for them. He had provoked a truth realm expert when he himself was in the Xiantian realm, and he had killed a top expert of the half-step legendary realm when he was in the truth realm. It wasn't clear how many geniuses had died in his hands since the beginning. However, the most miserable condition was that of the army of God. For out of the 5 gods had died at the hands of Yi Shiwen. It could be said that he had nearly wiped out the entire army of God. The first god had disappeared without a trace, while the remainder of the army of God had disappeared from the true martial university along with the defeat of the second god. Many members had also left the group. This organization had vanished like smoke in the air as a result. One mustn't expect mercy if they dared to offend Yi Shiwen. In fact, he had a big fallout with the law enforcement hall on his very first day in the true martial university. Such courage was absolutely amazing. After all, they had heard that the true martial university's law enforcement hall was a powerful organization. They also had similar institutions working inside their forces. Even a Heaven's Pride expert wouldn't dare to cause trouble for such an institution on their very first day. However, Yi Shiwen had done so. Moreover, he was still alive and kicking. So, one could clearly see his tyranny and uncommonness. However, they were even more shocked after they heard Yi Shiwen's accomplishments. He had killed 2 Heaven's Pride experts and had effortlessly defeated one. Such strength was bound to amaze everyone. Nobody had been optimistic about him in the fight with that Titan body. However, Yi Shiwen had eventually defeated him. Several disciples gasped in amazement as they heard this. Each of these Heaven's Pride expert was more ferocious than the other. Emperor Qin had turned out to be very ferocious in the beginning. Yi Shiwen hadn't killed as many Heaven's Pride experts as he had. However, he was also an extremely ferocious expert, without a doubt. Qi Fifan looked at Yi Shiwen. Other people didn't know. However, he knew that Yi Shiwen's accomplishments weren't any short of Emperor Chen's. He had once killed more than hundreds of elites, 2 Heaven's Pride experts, and a quasi-Heaven's Pride expert in a large-scale battle. Such an accomplishment was doomed to stay hidden in the dark forever. However, it was sufficient to prove Yi Shiwen's tyranny. The complexions of Xueyan Luo and Huang Luoqin had turned somewhat complicated as they looked at Yi Shiwen. They didn't expect that their junior disciple, who used to be far inferior to them in the past, would become so famous that his accomplishments would leave the Heaven's Pride experts of the other forces sighing with amazement. It's amusing. It's very interesting. Ha 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 ha. Qi Tian laughed out loud and went out of the restaurant. The twin Star brothers didn't stay for long either, and left the restaurant soon after. The all-knowing scholar immediately rose to fame after such an incident. Many people didn't believe that the all-knowing scholar was genuinely omniscient. However, they had no choice but to believe that the all-knowing scholar truly had an extremely outstanding information network after this matter. Xueyan Luo and the others went down to buy the information they needed after the Heaven's Pride experts left the restaurant. Yi Shiwen also went along with them, and most people inquired about the information on the remaining Heaven's Pride experts. Yi Shiwen saw the information on the other Heaven's Pride experts. He found that each of these Heaven's Pride expert was more tyrannical than the others. Most of them had killed or defeated at least one Heaven's Pride expert at some point of time. However, Emperor Qin had killed the most number of Heaven's Pride experts. In fact, he had killed 4 Heaven's Pride experts in total. Yi Shiwen wouldn't be a match for Emperor Qin either, unless Pang Yongbo and Hong Zhouyuan were taken into the count. Yi Shiwen looked at the information on Qi Tian. A big force like the Fire Cloud Cave had sent only one representative in this time's competition. He undoubtedly had tyrannical strength. The 100 Barbarians Cave and Devil Worship cult had collectively launched an attack on the Fire Cloud Cave to capture it. Qi Tian had killed 2 Heaven's Pride experts at that time, one from each enemy force, and that 2 within a short period of time. He hadn't killed them at the same time, but it was obvious that he possessed tyrannical strength. Yi Shiwen had also been present there at that time, so he had also experienced the intensity of that situation. However, Qi Tian had still managed to kill 2 Heaven's Pride experts in a row in that kind of situation. It meant that his strength was quite tyrannical. Yi Shiwen also looked at the information on the Xian Yuan twin stars. They had never paid attention to him. However, he was interested in them regardless of that. The Xian Yuan twin stars were also quite high-handed according to the all-knowing scholar's information. Only a few people would be able to deal with a tag team of these 2. They had killed several elite experts of many forces in their region since the beginning of their expedition to prove their excellence. Moreover, 2 Heaven's Pride experts had died at their hands. These 2 were truly amongst the most powerful of experts. Each China Sea's Jin Wushuang had also killed a Heaven's Pride expert in his territory. However, the True Martial University's 2 experts had been placed at the bottom of this list because they hadn't had the merit of killing a Heaven's Pride expert yet. Each of them had only defeated 1 Heaven's Pride expert so far. After all, it wasn't easy for the Heaven's Pride experts of the True Martial University to go on an expedition to prove their excellence, because the entire southern region was ruled by the True Martial University. So, it wasn't easy to find an opportunity to kill a Heaven's Pride expert, unless one was in special circumstances such as Yi Shiwen had once been. But the same wasn't true for the Heaven's Pride experts of other regions, since their regions were relatively more chaotic. Even Yi Shiwen wouldn't have defeated 2 Heaven's Pride experts if Fan Ming hadn't penetrated deep inside the True Martial University's territory, and that Titan body expert hadn't challenged him to a death match. However, this was mere paper information. The degree of its concreteness would totally depend on the real fights. However, the True Martial University had sent these 2 to take part in this time's competition. So, there must have been some assurance. Otherwise, the True Martial University wouldn't have sent them since they'd become a laughingstock in front of others. Yi Shiwen looked at the information on these people and had no choice but to admit that each of these Heaven's Pride experts was ferocious. In fact, they were far more tyrannical than Pang Yongbo and the others. These Heaven's Pride experts were clearly far more tyrannical than those ones. They could kill more than 1 Heaven's Pride experts of the same level. This fact was bound to change their mindset. Such an achievement would obviously bring about a mega change in one's demeanor. It could even be said that killing a fellow Heaven's Pride expert would bring a complete transformation in oneself. It could also be said that these Heaven's Pride experts could have beaten Pang Yongbo rather easily. After all, he was much younger in age. This meant that his accumulation was far inferior to their deeper ones. Qi Fifan also looked at the information on these people and couldn't help but hold his breath. There was hardly any difference in their strength and his. These people were the elites of every major force out there. An ordinary Heaven's Pride expert wasn't powerful enough to kill them. There were many geniuses in this world. However, it must be mentioned that these people stood above the League of Geniuses. In fact, they were a group of tyrannical geniuses. Yi Shiwen. None of these are ordinary individuals. I'm afraid even you may not be able to win easily. Qi Fifan spoke up anxiously. Xueyan Luo and Huang Luochen also looked at Yi Shiwen in a worried manner. These people were considered powerful, but even they were startled after they looked at this information. These individuals were exceptionally powerful. In fact, it would be very difficult for an ordinary Heaven's Pride expert to deal with them. However, Huang Luochen had a lot of confidence in Yi Shiwen. He didn't feel that Yi Shiwen couldn't defeat them, but it would be difficult to say whether he would be able to win in an effortless manner. However, that was dependent on Yi Shiwen's strength, and how tyrannical was his strength was at present. Perhaps it had already reached a horrifying extent. Yi Shiwen smiled and replied, "There's no need to worry. I'll progress more quickly only if I continue to fight with these powerful people. And that's the only way I will achieve what I have to." Chief Yifan knew what Yi Shiwen meant by that. He merely sighed since he couldn't do anything about this matter. He knew the disparity between himself and ancient Phoenix world rather clearly. There was a difference of cloud and mud between them. In fact, it was akin to the difference between an eagle in the sky and an ant on the ground. The true significance of a strong opponent is in how thoroughly he gets knocked down by us, Yi Shiwen solemnly stated. To be continued. Chapter 441. The information on several heavens pride experts spread out at a terrifying speed after the ruckus caused by Qi Tian and a few others. The participants found out that these heavens pride experts were their biggest obstacle. They weren't the opponents of these heavens pride experts. In fact, they would consider themselves lucky if they managed to come out alive in case they came to face with these heavens pride experts. After all, several individuals had died at the hands of these heavens pride experts on the first day of competition. They didn't even have the slightest strength to fight back. There was even a quasi-heavens pride expert among those who had died, and they had all been killed in one move alone. So one could only imagine the huge disparity between these people and those heavens pride experts. Not to mention that these few were the elites among those heavens pride experts. So even an ordinary heavens pride expert wasn't a match for them. The past accomplishments of these heavens pride experts were turned over one by one. The more that was revealed, the more it shocked the people. The accomplishments of these heavens pride experts were too terrifying. Their accomplishments weren't the same as that of these peoples, despite the fact that they all belonged to the same generation. Each of these heavens pride expert had their own tyrannical records. Many people were dazzled at the sight of them. It was quite difficult to judge who among them was most tyrannical by merely looking at their accomplishments. However, everyone believed that Emperor Qin and the twin Stars brothers were the most tyrannical ones. It was a quiet night. It was probably an ordinary night for some people. However, it was an unbearable and endless night for many others. The next day's competition began early in the morning. 3 rounds were scheduled for today as well. Today's competition would be far more cruel and chaotic than yesterday's. However, it was nothing for the 8 heavens pride experts who were the center of public attention. It didn't matter how tyrannical their opponents would be. Everyone would get defeated in one move if they came across any of these 8 heavens pride experts. They needn't use any unnecessary moves to win either. They and the ordinary participants simply weren't on the same level. The disciples of Legendry's great, complete realm had gotten eliminated after the next 3 brutal rounds had taken place. All the disciples of the Yiyuan school had been eliminated, apart from Xueyan Luo and Huang Luochen. However, it had been extremely difficult for the 2 of them to make it through these 3 rounds. They had somehow managed to defeat their opponents and had come out victorious. They had become eligible to participate in the 7th round, but they knew that their footsteps would come to a halt very soon in this competition's ladder. The 3rd day had arrived in a flash, and the competition had reached the 7th round. It was a very difficult time for the disciples who had made it to this round. These disciples were at the semi-sage realm. The disciples below semi-sage realm had been eliminated by now. Even those 1 or 2 extraordinary Legendry's realm disciples had failed to cross the 6th round. Only a few experts of the initial stage of the semi-sage realm had reached the 7th round. Xueyan Luo and Huang Luochen were amongst them. The majority participants were the experts of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm, and the remaining experts were at the late stage of the semi-sage realm, and they were comparatively relaxed. Yi Shiwen genuinely has tyrannical strength. I've only seen his attacks, so far. I haven't seen him sustain any injuries. An attack simply can't injure him, no matter how terrifying that attack is. The Xian Yuan twin stars killed another individual yesterday. That idiot was a bit slow to admit his defeat. The twin stars cleft him into two as a result. Yi Shiwen had arrived at the public square. He restrained his aura and began to wait with the crowd. It seemed as if his presence had completely vanished. The disciples around him were discussing about the accomplishments of these heavens' pride experts. These disciples weren't as good as the heavens' pride experts. However, they were still considered elites among elites in their respective forces. They wouldn't possibly pay attention to some ordinary people. So, they were only discussing about the accomplishments of the heavens' pride experts. That's good. I'm afraid that Yi Shiwen is going to face a tough fight. His next opponent is Sun Jianpeng. He can be considered as a dark horse of this competition. He's one of the top experts of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. He is said to have practiced the inheritance of some ancient sorcerer. It is known as Immortal Hell King's rebirth scripture. It's an incredible technique which can help one in taking rebirths to no end. Moreover, his strength rises rather significantly each time he takes a rebirth. It has been reported that he has reincarnated rather recently, and his strength may have reached the level of a heavens pride expert. So, this fight is going to be interesting. Yi Shiwen frowned. He hadn't thought that his next opponent would turn out to be such an expert. This individual's strength must be tyrannical if he had genuinely caught up to the heavens' pride experts. Brother Yi, Shuiyan Luo and Huang Luochen arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. Shuiyan Luo opened her mouth and spoke. Brother Yi, you must advance very carefully today. Our Yi Yuan school's glory is dependent on you. It had been a few years since she had arrived in the true martial university. However, she was habitual of calling herself a Yi Yuan school's disciple. After all, she had spent more than 100 years in the Yi Yuan school. Her feelings for Yi Yuan school couldn't be compared with those for the true martial university. How is it only dependent on me? Doesn't it depend on Sister Shui and Brother Huang as well? Yi Shiwen asked. Don't be ridiculous. We know our levels. We are lucky enough that we've reached till this round. However, we may not be able to cross the next round. Shuiyan Luo replied, My opponents for the next round are those twin stars brothers. But Brother Huang's still in a better condition than I am. He would be clashing with a quasi-heavens pride expert of the Fire Cloud Cave in the next round. Perhaps we won't be able to cross the next round. Sister Shui, your opponents are those two? Yi Shiwen frowned. Those two brothers weren't good people. It could be said that they were a pair of calamity stars who brought bad omen. Sister Shui, you go in and surrender without any delay. Do not hesitate. Shuiyan Luo pouted in response, but she knew that Yi Shiwen had only suggested this for her own good. She was no match for those two calamity stars. Her strength had reached the semi-sage realm only recently. Moreover, it had been quite unstable for a while. It had come to stabilize after passing through the battles of the last 2 days, but it had only stabilized in the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. Therefore, there was a difference of heaven and earth between the strength of those twin brothers and hers. I'm afraid they will resort to extreme methods if they found out that you're related to me. That would be too bad, Yi Shiwen added. Yi Shiwen had seen the eyes of those two arrogant brothers. So, he knew that they weren't generous people. Words like innocence, mercy, etc. didn't suit them. So, she might have to face the worst if they found that he and Shuiyan Luo were related. It would be truly awful if she were to die because of that. Yi Shiwen could imagine that possibility. The Heaven's Pride experts had defeated their opponents in just one move during the previous matches, and that too without using their full strength. So, Shuiyan Luo would certainly die if she didn't surrender fast enough, and her opponents used their entire strength. Shuiyan Luo understood the seriousness of the matter as she heard Yi Shiwen's words. She had initially anticipated that she'd be able to stop the first move of those two individuals. However, she realized that she'd die in only one move if her opponents resorted to extreme methods. Yi Shiwen took out an innerwear armor from his spatial ring. He looked at Shuiyan Luo and said, "Sister Shui, this innerwear armor is a pseudo-sage tool. You must wear it. You won't die even if they attacked you." Yi Shiwen was worried for her. That's why he had taken out this pseudo-sage tool, an innerwear armor. He obviously hadn't refined it himself. He had found it inside the spatial ring of Yuan Hongzhou. Tools like this innerwear armor had always been very precious. Perhaps the value of this one was comparable to a low-quality sage tool. In fact, many Sage Realm experts couldn't afford to buy a pseudo-sage armor. A Heaven's Pride expert, like Yuan Hongzhou, could buy such a tool because of the unceasing supply of resources from his force. No, this is too precious. Shuiyan Luo promptly declined it. She knew the value of this innerwear armor rather clearly. She had reached the semi-sage realm only recently. However, she and a majority of other semi-sage experts couldn't afford to buy even ordinary pseudo-sage tools. They used to be elites back in the Yuan school. They had the support of their school, and they had received all kinds of resources in abundance. However, they were nothing inside the true martial university. There were too many disciples like them in the true martial university. Such individuals might only accumulate enough primary spirit dawn to buy a pseudo-sage tool after they had entered the late stage of semi-sage realm. Moreover, this was a high-quality armor. It could change one's fate. It could save one's life in the most desperate of situations. So it was extremely precious. Even many sage experts couldn't afford to buy this. But Yi Shiwen had said that he would give it to her. So he would definitely give it to her. "Sister Shui, don't reject it. This armor is useless for me. It will only be of any use if it can save your life in an accident," Yi Shiwen said. Yi Shiwen had always been ruthless towards his enemies. However, he was never mean when it came to his friends. Moreover, it wasn't his personal thing to begin with, so he wouldn't regret giving it away. In fact, he wasn't talking nonsense either. That armor wouldn't make any difference for him. His body itself was tyrannical enough. In fact, a pseudo-sage tool would be of no use if his gilded tyrant form failed to resist an attack. The situation was similar to the time he had killed Pang Yongbo. His armor had been torn apart by Yi Shiwen as if it were nothing. "Take it." Huang Luoqin opened his mouth and spoke up. It was rare for him to speak out of the blue. "All right, I will accept it." Shuiyan Luo laughed and said. She was full of gratitude towards Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen had done it rather casually as if it was no big deal. However, she knew the value of this gift. "Sister Shui, I will come and block their way to help you in getting out of there once you've surrendered." Yi Shiwen laughed out loud and said, "It's good that we had a chat in advance. The first round is about to begin." Yi Shiwen heard the melodious, ringing sound of the bell coming from the mountain. The spectators and the big personalities had already arrived. Yi Shiwen had become accustomed to it since it was the third day. Yi Shiwen marched on the rhythm of the ringing bell sounds and entered the microcosm with his token in his hand. To be continued. Chapter 442. Yi Shiwen entered the microcosm and saw a young man inside. He appeared to be in his 20s. He was clad in a yellowish-orange robe. He looked a bit arrogant. The principles were looming over his body. Yi Shiwen counted and found out that there were 999 Tao principles on his body. Yi Shiwen also noticed that his aura was a bit unstable. This clearly meant that he must have made a breakthrough very recently. This level of strength was sufficient to be ranked as a Heaven's Pride expert. However, he wasn't present in the known lineup of Heaven's Pride experts. This showed that he hadn't cultivated till half-step Legendary's great, complete realm. However, he had still managed to condense 999 Tao principles, even though he hadn't reached the half-step legendary's great, complete realm. This was nothing less than a small miracle. This must have some relation with the power technique that he had practiced. Immortal Hell King's rebirth scripture. Yi Shiwen didn't know what kind of a power technique it was. He could have asked Yi Mo about it. However, Yi Mo was in deep slumber at the moment. Therefore, he had lost contact with Yi Mo. However, even Yi Mo might not know about it. After all, they're used to so many sages in the ancient times. So, the number of power techniques created by them was as many as the stars in the sky. It was obviously impossible for someone to know about all of them. You are Yi Shiwen? Sun Jian Peng wasn't afraid, nor did he show any signs of fear when he saw Yi Shiwen. In fact, he seemed a bit excited on the contrary. Yes, excited. And Yi Shiwen could clearly see this from his facial expression. He wasn't excited to meet his opponent. Rather, he was excited with the fact that he would soon become famous. Yes, I am. Yi Shiwen casually replied. I hadn't thought that I would meet you here like this. I'm very excited. Sun Jian Peng burst into laughter and said, You may not know how famous you are in our Xianyuan Palace Hall. I will be acknowledged as someone worthy of being a Heaven's Pride expert as long as I can kill you. And I will fill up the position left vacant by Fan Ming if that happens. You'd better watch out. And don't underestimate my strength. Sun Jian Peng continued to speak. He seemed like a person who had been longing for recognition for a long time, and he had suddenly become excited since he had been presented with such an opportunity. Idiot! Yi Shiwen opened his mouth and spat out this word. What did you say? Sun Jian Peng got angry. A person like you won't understand. How can someone like you understand my thought process? A person like you must die. Hell King's disaster blade. Sun Jian Peng shouted. An immeasurable demonic aura emerged out from his body. The entire 999 Tao principles on his body began to boil and started to flutter in the sky. It seemed as if every Tao principle could crush an ordinary semi-sage expert to death. He had claimed to have the strength to beat Yi Shiwen, and his claim wasn't entirely false either. He genuinely possessed tyrannical strength. In fact, it was enough to make him a ranked Heaven's Pride expert. Yi Shiwen had heard someone say that Sun Jian Peng wasn't this ferocious in the past. However, he had recently taken a rebirth, so his strength had advanced by leaps and bounds. In fact, it had increased enough to place him in the ranks of Heaven's Pride experts. Moreover, he had been enraged by Yi Shiwen only moments ago, so he had attacked in rage. One could well imagine his strength. Endless black clouds shrouded the sky in an instant, and cold winds began to blow around like astral winds. Sun Jian Peng brandished his long blade. He appeared like an ancient god. It seemed as if he was an ancient god of death, and the tip of his blade carried certain death. In fact, it seemed as if innumerable souls were angrily howling at the tip of his blade. Sun Jian Peng's long blade transformed into 100-feet-long blood blade in the void. It carried boundless negative energy as it swept towards Yi Shiwen. It slashed down upon Yi Shiwen, and it seemed as if it would cleave him into two. Yi Shiwen suddenly took a step as boundless golden light emitted from his body and propelled him forward. He managed to avoid this terrifying blade attack. Crash! The long black ferociously smashed on the ground. It crushed the surface and opened a hundreds of feet long massive crack. It was extremely deep and scary in make. Ha! Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. He transformed into a golden streamer and instantly arrived in front of Sun Jian Peng. It's over now! You're too naive. Sun Jian Peng's face exposed a sinister look. Seemingly endless negative energy condensed on top of his long blade. It took the shape of a sharp arrow and went lasing towards Yi Shiwen. Whoosh! This long arrow made of negative energy cut across the vast sky. It shattered the space and nearly struck its target, Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen jumped and avoided this sharp arrow. Sun Jian Peng brandished his 100-feet-long and dreadful great blade towards Yi Shiwen to chop him down once again. It cracked the space to reveal the void on the other side and shook the ninth heaven. Yi Shiwen's pupils contracted. This great blade was actually a sage tool, so its power was infinite. Moreover, it seemed as if Sun Jian Peng's martial art was compatible with this sage tool. An attack made from a sage tool was obviously going to possess endless might. There was a difference of heaven and earth between a pseudo-sage tool and a sage tool. It was like the difference between the semi-sage realm and sage realm. In fact, an attack unleashed from a sage tool would carry endless might even if it hadn't been used by a sage expert. The spectators who were watching this fight from the outside also recognized this sage tool, and they were left shocked at this discovery. Only a top-notch expert could possess a sage tool. The dreadful might of this sage tool had also left them incredibly shocked. Something like a pseudo-sage tool was considered a legendary item in their eyes, let alone a sage tool. In fact, several sage experts were still using pseudo-sage tools. The long blade smashed down at a very fast speed. Bang! The entire space exploded and shattered into small pieces. The faces of many people had turned pale with fear. The dreadful might of this sage tool had left them to gasp in admiration. It wasn't surprising that Sun Jian Peng was so arrogant and despotic. After all, he possessed such a dreadful weapon. Nobody was optimistic about him in the beginning. His strength might have been catching up to that of a Heaven's Pride expert. However, the man in front of him had already killed 2 Heaven's Pride experts and had effortlessly defeated 1 more in the past. However, everything changed when Sun Jian Peng used a sage tool. The unexpected appearance of this sage tool was enough to reverse the situation. Yi Shiwen, you will die today. Sun Jian Peng sneered and spoke. He was gasping heavily for breath. A sage tool was certainly very powerful. However, using it also resulted in great consumption of energy. He had reached the peak of the semi-sage realm. However, it wasn't enough for him to continue its usage for a long time. He had merely brandished it twice and had already begun to pant heavily. Yi Shiwen's figure appeared in the void. His golden wings stretched out behind his body for several feet. He began to stroll in the void. He was clad in golden divine clothes and appeared just like a god. His vision had turned cold. The fighting intention was clearly visible in his eyes. Then an endless amount of sword intention condensed into a long sword in his hand. Yi Shiwen, I will give you an opportunity to die in a dignified way. Sun Jian Peng laughed out loud. He was laughing in such a hysterical manner that he looked a little crazed. He was very pleased with himself. The feelings which had remained restrained for a long time had finally begun to see the bout in a crazy manner. He had gone completely mad as a result. He had been under pressure for many years. Why are those Heaven's Pride experts aloof from the rest of the world, as if they are looking down on the world as if they are gods, just like this Yi Shiwen is? So, he loathed Yi Shiwen and wanted to destroy him. He wanted to use his long blade to kill these so-called Heaven's Pride experts and prove that he was more powerful than them. He wanted to prove that those Heaven's Pride experts were like trash in front of him. That's all. He hated this world. He hated it for not being able to understand and appreciate his talent. You're insane. Yi Shiwen indifferently said, Yes, I am insane. You people have forced me to be like this. You Heaven's Pride experts are nothing. You are nothing. Sun Jian Peng laughed out loud crazily as he replied. Yi Shiwen looked solemn. He understood Sun Jian Peng's mindset. There were several Heaven's Pride experts in this world, and everyone else grew up under the shadow of these Heaven's Pride experts. However, Yi Shiwen didn't argue with him as to whether he was right or wrong. Sun Jian Peng had plunged to the depths of extreme delusion. Yi Shiwen had never considered himself as a heaven's pride expert, nor had he ever thought that they were insurmountable. In fact, he didn't consider himself to be the heaven's favorite child like those other heaven's pride experts did. He didn't possess outstanding talent like they did. He also hadn't possessed an exceptional body foundation since birth. He had to struggle for everything that he possessed today. In fact, he wouldn't have his current strength if he hadn't risked his life countless times. I know you can't brandish that great blade of yours several times. I could simply exhaust you to death if I wanted to. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to understand the real difference in our strengths. Yi Shiwen spoke up in a cold voice. That great blade had grown very big after absorbing the demonic negative energies of the dead people. This kind of a sage tool demanded a lot from its wielder. It could even devour its owner if there was a rebound. Ha ha ha. I hate the way you think you're so self-righteous. Sun Jianpeng laughed in a hysterical manner. In fact, he now hated Yi Shiwen as much as he hated those other heaven's pride experts combined. He got even crazier when he saw a trace of pity in Yi Shiwen's eyes. He didn't need someone's pity. He didn't want sympathy. He would rather kill those who dare to sympathize with him. Bang! Sun Jianpeng unleashed his ominous power. It was quite dreadful. The energy of the dead emerged out of his body. The souls of countless dead people began to howl as they gathered and condensed into two terrifying blood-red eyes behind his body. He aimed the long blade in his hand at Yi Shiwen and rushed towards Yi Shiwen. He broke the void with his steps. He was undoubtedly a lone person, but his imposing aura appeared similar to that of a cavalry of thousands of ghost soldiers. You think too highly of yourself. Take this move. Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. The golden divine beams blossomed from his body. His entire body became golden. This could have ranked him among the gods. Then he brandished his long sword. Buried heaven's sword. Clang! Yi Shiwen's long sword began to spin in his palm in a crazed manner. It gradually turned into a cyclone of energy and swept out. It began to rotate even more crazily as it obscured the entire sky. Many disciples of Legendary Realm were watching this fight from a different space. They couldn't even see the figures of these two. This was a peerless counterattack. The long blade and the long sword suddenly collided. Bang! The space shattered into small pieces, just like glass. The massive energy waves overflowed the sky and swept in all directions. The chaos leaked out, and the killing intention flooded the entire space. Bang! A loud noise was emanated as a result of the collision. A figure went flying out from the inexhaustible cyclone. To be continued. Chapter 443. A terrifying cyclone swept out in all directions. The entire microcosm was nearly shattered into small pieces by this frightening cyclone. A chill ran inside the hearts of the spectating disciples. Everyone was in extreme shock, and their hair stood on end with fear. This level of fighting strength was extremely terrifying, not to mention that this was merely semi-sage level strength. It would have been an extremely dreadful scene if the strength of the contenders had been at the level of the sage realm. Such a terrifying battle could only take place between two heaven's pride experts. All heaven's pride experts were brilliant and outstanding. However, only one among them could carry forward his glory till the end and win the trophy. Therefore, every big force would always try to reduce the unnecessary collisions between heaven's pride experts. In fact, several heaven's pride experts of the semi-sage realm had never clashed with each other even once. This was done to ensure that these heaven's pride experts grew up smoothly. After all, the semi-sage realm was only the beginning. This was the fiercest battle between the experts of younger generation so far. It had already touched the peak of the semi-sage realm. A violent energy storm had swept out in all directions in an instant. The entire space had been shattered into pieces, like a glass. The massive energy waves had overflowed the sky and had swept in all directions. The chaos had leaked out from the other side, while the killing intention had flooded the entire space. Bang! A loud noise was heard as a figure was sent flying out from the inexhaustible cyclone. Everyone's gazes fell on the figure that had come flying out the cyclone. It was Sun Jianpeng. Some people had guessed correctly that it might be Sun Jianpeng. However, they were still taken aback. Everyone had anticipated that Sun Jianpeng wouldn't be able to prevail over Yi Shiwen when the contest had begun. However, everyone had started to believe that he might be able to beat Yi Shiwen after he had taken out a sage tool. However, their prediction had again turned wrong, since it was Yi Shiwen who stood victorious. Sun Jianpeng went flying across the sky and crashed into a mountain. He lost his consciousness thereafter. It wasn't clear whether he was dead or alive. That inexhaustible cyclone tore the entire microcosm to pieces. The pieces of space debris then scattered in the dark chaos. Yi Shiwen's figure became visible the very next moment. Yi Shiwen's entire body was covered with golden divinities at this moment. The divinities were boiling and made it seem like he was clad in golden and divine clothes. He appeared like a god. True Martial University's Yi Shiwen wins this fight. The referee passed the judgment after he had verified that Sun Jianpeng had lost the ability to fight further. Several disciples couldn't believe this. Just one move again. Yi Shiwen had defeated a formidable expert of the rank of Heaven's Pride experts in just one move. Yi Shiwen had used just one move throughout the fight and had defeated his opponent in a convincing manner. How tyrannical was this Yi Shiwen? People simply weren't able to digest this fact. Some of the Heaven's Pride experts were stronger, while some were weaker. Everyone was aware of this fact. However, how could there exist such a huge disparity among them? The match had been settled in one move. This level of disparity had pushed everyone in despair. How's this possible? Sun Jianpeng is as powerful as a Heaven's Pride expert. However, he couldn't withstand a single blow while facing Yi Shiwen. He got defeated in one move, in merely one move. Is the disparity between these Heaven's Pride experts genuinely so wide? It's truly unbelievable. Now, I genuinely don't know who among Yi Shiwen, Emperor Qin, and the Twin Stars brothers is stronger. Sun Jianpeng was definitely the biggest dark horse in this time's competition. However, he appeared so weak in front of Yi Shiwen. How can there be such a big gap between them? This is unbelievable. Everyone was in shock after having witnessed this outcome. It seemed as if they had seen some kind of miracle. However, they didn't know that Yi Shiwen's strength had already surpassed the pinnacle of the semi-sage realm. He had already condensed 1,000 Tao principles. So, his strength had increased several times as compared to what it used to be. In fact, it could be said that his current strength was on a whole new level. But Sun Jianpeng had only reached the level of Heaven's Pride experts. In fact, he was a bit weaker than Pangyang Bo and those others from before. Yi Shiwen would have killed him in one slap if he hadn't possessed that sage tool, the Great Blade. It was impossible for him to affect Yi Shiwen in any way. Yi Shiwen came out of the microcosm and landed on the ground. The nearby space suddenly distorted and broke into pieces. Then the broken space fragments fell on the surface of the metropolis Martial Peak. A figure flew out from the space debris. Yi Shiwen wondered, who has made such a fierce attack that the space itself has been broken into pieces? Yi Shiwen suddenly shot a glance at that figure and saw that it was Xueyan Luo. Yes, it was Xueyan Luo. The innerwear armor which was given to her by Yi Shiwen had been shattered. She looked tired and feeble. Her bones had been shattered. She was panting heavily. Bang! A burst of power, which was a blend of water and fire, swept out from that microcosm. A huge tornado of fire and water surged towards Xueyan Luo. It was advancing straight towards her in order to kill her. How could Yi Shiwen allow that to happen? He shouted loudly. Clang! A long sword appeared in his hand out of nowhere. It was then raised up in the sky. It transformed into a hundreds of feet long sword in the void and slashed down towards that huge tornado to crush it. Rumble! That massive tornado was annihilated by the irresistible force of that long sword. Xian Yuan twin stars! Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth. His eyes turned cold. He looked like an enraged wild beast. Who has dared to interfere in our matter? The twin stars brothers suddenly came out through the crack in the space. Was it you? The twin stars brothers asked in unison. Ha ha ha. This is the fate of those who oppose our Xian Yuan Palace Hall. You will die. Even the people around you will die. They suddenly broke into a wild laughter as they said. As expected, they had resorted to extreme methods because of Yi Shiwen. That was visible from the serious injuries on her body. She would have died if Yi Shiwen hadn't given her that innerwear armor. Yi Shiwen restrained his anger and walked towards Shuiyan Luo. He said, "You too are lucky. You should be glad that you're still alive. Pray that you don't come across me. I will make you die a miserable death if you do." This was the first time that Yi Shiwen had felt such strong, killing intention for someone. He was burning with anger because of these two individuals' despicable nature. Shuiyan Luo was as insignificant as an ant on the ground to them. They could smash a group of ants any time by stepping on them, and they wouldn't feel anything about it. However, the same wasn't true in Yi Shiwen's case. Dream on! The twin stars brothers' complexions changed. Yi Shiwen's words had made them extremely furious. Nobody had ever dared to talk to them like that, especially when they felt that they hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, they felt that Yi Shiwen should be grateful to them since they had allowed him to live for a few days. However, he had dared to threaten them instead. Yi Shiwen ignored the twin stars brothers and walked up to Shuiyan Luo to help her heal. She had sustained very serious injuries. However, it was nothing for Yi Shiwen's Phoenix regeneration technique. Yi Shiwen had sustained even more serious injuries than hers in the past. His injuries had been more serious, and he had been left to hang on the last few breaths. He was merely at half-step legendary realm at that time, and he had been chased by a semi-sage expert. That situation was far more dangerous than Shuiyan Luo's present one. The twin stars brothers flew in a rage when they saw that Yi Shiwen hadn't paid attention to them. However, they couldn't attack in any case. They knew where they were at the moment. So, they had no choice but to leave with a bitter taste in their mouths. Yi Shiwen used the field effect of the Phoenix regeneration technique to treat Shuiyan Luo rather quickly. The ruddy expression slowly came back to her face. Her complexion no longer looked pale, and she slowly regained consciousness. "Brother Yi, thanks a lot." Shuiyan Luo thanked him. She couldn't put the feeling of gratitude she that had in her heart for Yi Shiwen in mere words. She would have died if Yi Shiwen hadn't given her that armor. "How did this happen? Didn't you admit defeat?" Yi Shiwen asked. He had told her to surrender since he knew that the twin stars brothers might resort to extreme methods. However, he hadn't expected that they would succeed in doing that. "They are too cruel. I surrendered as soon as I went inside, just as you had told me. However, they still attacked me." Shuiyan Luo's face exposed extreme anger. "Yi Shiwen, you must avenge me and kill them." Shuiyan Luo spoke up angrily. She would have been dead by now if she hadn't worn Yi Shiwen's innerwear armor. Those two had almost succeeded in killing her. Therefore, it was only natural that she hated them from the bottom of her heart. "Don't worry. They won't get away. They will die this time." Yi Shiwen replied in a cold voice. Only one party would live, either him or those twin stars brothers. The killing intention had become incomparably intense in his heart. Yi Shiwen took Shuiyan Luo to the base of the mountain after she had recovered. After all, only winners were permitted to stay in this public square. Losers were sent away to some other place, and Shuiyan Luo wasn't an exception either. Yi Shiwen returned to the public square. The 7th round had ended by then. Therefore, the disciples in the entire public square were excited to discuss about the upcoming 8th round. That was because two heavyweight disciples were likely to face each other in the 8th round, the True Martial University's Qin Wang and East Sea's Emperor Qin. These two individuals had been Heaven's Pride experts for a long time. They would finally face each other in the next round. Yi Shiwen had defeated Sun Jianpeng in the previous round, and Sun Jianpeng's fighting strength was equal to that of a Heaven's Pride expert. However, he was known to all as a barely Heaven's Pride expert. However, Qin Wang and Emperor Chen were different. They had been famous for several years. Moreover, they were considered as top elites in their respective forces. One could say that the competition for this time's championship would take place between 8 individuals, and only one among these 8 individuals would win this time's competition. However, nobody had thought that 2 of them would face each other in the 8th round itself. This would be a stunning battle for sure. Other fights of this round would look dull in front of this battle. So, everyone's focus was bound to be fixed on this battle. To be continued. Chapter 444. Qin Wang and Emperor Qin are finally going to face each other. Perhaps we'll be able to see an interesting showdown this time. Neither of these individuals is a simple personality. Emperor Chen had once defeated 2 Heaven's Pride experts at the same time. He is known as the undisputed king in the East Sea. Gee, he's so courageous. Qin Wang isn't an ordinary person either. Do you know why he's known as Qin Wang? This title was given to him because once he had wiped out a small country by himself in order to increase the territory of his own country. 1. Some people knew him as Qin Wang the King. They addressed him as king whenever he would pass by. Everyone suddenly gasped. Wiped out a small country on his own. It was merely a small country. However, even a small country in the true martial world had a population of at least 10 million people. Then, how many experts that small country might have had? And he had annihilated all of them by himself. He was definitely very powerful and ferocious. Neither of these 2 individuals was easy to deal with. So, their clash would obviously be a startling collision. Even Yi Shiwen was very interested in the battle of these 2 individuals. It didn't matter whether Qin Wang had annihilated a small country or Emperor Qin had simultaneously defeated 2 Heaven's Pride experts. One thing was clear, that none of these 2 individuals was an ordinary person. Their battle would shake the heavens. However, the most important thing for him was to cross the 8th round of the competition as early as possible. These other things didn't matter to him. He should be able to settle this round rather quickly if the opponent didn't turn out to be a Heaven's Pride expert of the rank of Emperor Qin. He could come out and would have enough time to watch Emperor Chen's fight if he was able to win the round quickly enough. The 8th round of the competition began soon. This was today's 2nd round. There were fewer participants in today's competition as compared to the total number of participants in the last 2 days. In fact, it was just a tiny portion of the first day's number. Yi Shiwen entered the competition space for his fight. A young expert was waiting for him inside the microcosm. He was a top expert of the late stage of the semi-sage realm, so he was obviously outstanding. However, there was a big disparity between him and a Heaven's Pride expert. He surrendered as soon as he saw Yi Shiwen. He wasn't a coward, but he could see the reality. Yi Shiwen had defeated Sun Jianpeng, a man who was close to the rank of a Heaven's Pride expert at a lightning speed. So he was aware of the disparity between him and Yi Shiwen. He knew that he couldn't be Yi Shiwen's match. True Martial University's Yi Shiwen wins this fight. Nobody was surprised to see this result. After all, not many individuals had the courage to compete with such a ferocious Heaven's Pride expert. Yi Shiwen came out of his microcosm and entered a subspace from where several spectators had gathered to watch the most anticipated fight. This fight had just begun. Countless disciples present around him were talking about this matter. One of the contenders belonged to the East Sea, where Emperor Qin was revered as the undisputed king. Another contender had come from the southern region, where his opponent had exterminated a small country. Everyone was very excited to see these two individuals. Emperor Chen was sitting on a tall and robust-looking golden lion. He was clad in dark red armor. It wasn't a well-known armor, yet it was exuding traces of sage power that scared everyone. They felt a sense of urgency, as if they had been cornered. He was holding a long spear in his hand, and it was pointed forward. It was decorated with ancient symbols. It was evidently an ancient weapon of some big force. It had wandered from person to person over the ages, and had finally fallen into the hands of Emperor Qin. Emperor Qin began to advance slowly. He seemed like a devil god riding a strange and ancient golden beast. Qin Huang was sitting atop an incomparably elegant and divine steed. He didn't show any weakness in front of Emperor Qin. He was clad in a black armor, and his head was covered with a mask. People couldn't see his face because of the mask. He was holding a lance in his hand. His eyes looked ice-cold. These two individuals are so ferocious that even their imposing auras can suffocate people to death, a person exclaimed. Several people held their breaths in amazement. Their eyes were fixed on these two individuals. They couldn't help but be involuntarily affected by the terrifying, imposing auras of these two individuals. Everyone was secretly asking oneself whether they could be an opponent of these two individuals. However, nobody dared to say that they could be. Qin Huang and Emperor Qin were very powerful. Both of them were extremely ferocious. They were well-known figures among the heavens' pride experts. They were one step away from entering the sage realm. Many of the spectators who had come to see their fight trembled in fear. Even Yi Shiwen's complexion slowly sank a bit. He believed Emperor Qin to be his biggest opponent, and there was a possibility that Emperor Qin might lose this fight. The best outcome would be that both of them mutually wounded each other before the fight ended. However, it probably wouldn't affect Emperor Qin's fighting strength by much. That was because Yi Shiwen and these other experts who had reached such a high level were bound to have some incredible sage-level healing technique. These healing techniques might not be as good as Phoenix regeneration technique. However, they would be sufficient to restore the injuries quite quickly. I'm giving you a choice. Surrender or die. Emperor Qin announced in a cold voice. He merely spoke 2 sentences, but that had been enough to shock everyone. Emperor Qin looked cold and decisive, just like a god. Surrender or die. Who could have dared to talk to Qin Huang like this except him? Anyways, Qin Huang was a top heavens pride expert. So, it wasn't easy to defeat him either. Not to mention that such an arrogant provocation wasn't going to work on him. You're insane. But it doesn't matter. I've met crazier people, and they've all been turned into ghosts by my lance. Qin Huang opened his mouth and proclaimed. His voice sounded as if it was coming out of a closed jar. It was because of the mask he was wearing. So, there was no way to identify his real voice. Qin Huang hadn't showed any weakness in front of the arrogant Emperor Qin. Instead, he had threatened Emperor Qin to turn him into a ghost. How many people possessed such boldness? It seems that you have chosen to die. Many people like you have misread these situations. Emperor Qin coldly replied. His eyes had turned cold. It seemed as if he could see right through Qin Huang's mask. It seemed as if his sword-like sharp vision could see beyond his proud face, absorb his soul, and then sever his pride as well. Emperor Qin moved, and his golden lion also moved along with him. It carried Emperor Qin like a small mountain, and advanced towards Qin Huang to crush him. A tyrannical aura swept out of his body and surged across like ocean waves. So strong! Everyone was shocked by this scene. No opponent had been able to compel Emperor Qin to such an extent in the past. In fact, no one had managed to withstand even a single move of his. He would always beat his opponents very quickly. However, Qin Huang was completely different. He had spoken such insulting words to Emperor Qin. Yet, Emperor Chen's actions clearly indicated that he was giving significant importance to Qin Huang. Yi Shiwen's complexion turned serious. Emperor Qin deserved Yi Shiwen's attention. He truly possessed extremely tyrannical strength. A person would be scared to death while facing his imposing aura if they didn't possess enough strength. Is this all you've got? Qin Huang shouted angrily. Endless killing intention swept out of his body. One could vaguely hear the complaints and grievances of countless crying souls. Of course, these were the souls of the experts who belonged to that small country he had wiped out. It seemed as if they were complaining about something. However, they were merely fluttering about in the sky as souls. Rumble! The long spear and the lance ferociously collided in that split second. The sound of the terrifying collision of metals exploded. The collision produced endless sparks. These sparks then spattered in all directions. These sparks seemed ordinary, but were simply inexhaustible. They burnt the space where they went. The burnt space then broke into small pieces. It was like a mirror had been ruptured from the middle, and had started to appear like a spider's web, densely packed and extending along all sides. Clang! The space couldn't endure such a collision and smashed into pieces. It produced crisp metallic sounds. The void was exposed as the space was smashed into pieces. Everyone was dumbstruck and held their breaths. A chill ran inside everyone. These two individuals were extremely ferocious. This was such an incredible attack. Wasn't it similar to the attack of those twin stars brothers a while ago, the one that had broken the space into pieces? Everyone was extremely terrified. It was indeed a terrible scene, but had been very much a possibility since both these individuals were tyrannical enough to be ranked as the top experts in their realm. Not to mention that they were clashing against each other right now. Ha 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 ha. Emperor Qin laughed callously. His fighting intention had become stronger. In fact, it had started to seethe. His imposing aura had become even more formidable. It seemed as if Qin Huang had obtained his approval of being a deserving opponent. Qin Huang's complexion looked extremely grave and stern. There wasn't any trace of arrogance in his eyes. The golden lion on which Emperor Chen was seated faced upwards and let out a long and loud roar. Then, a dreadful aura swept out in all directions. Everyone was scared by this golden lion's aura. The golden lion had condensed 999 Tao principles, just like any other top expert. This shocked everyone. This golden lion could be compared with a top heavens pride expert. So, it wasn't surprising that Emperor Qin didn't pay any attention to the Twin Stars brothers. The Twin Stars brothers would be merely equal to two heavens pride experts if they joined hands. However, Emperor Chen and his mount would be equal to two top-tier heavens pride experts if they fought together. Who could resist such a team? How did this golden lion condense 999 Tao principles? What kind of astonishing bloodline did it possess that had allowed it to grow up to such an extent? The golden lion unleashed its power. Its entire body started to appear like it had been adorned in a golden armor. An imposing aura of the king of 10,000 beasts emerged from his body and spread across the void. Its 4 claws causally tore open a crack in the void. Yi Shiwen immediately understood from where Emperor Qin had gotten such confidence. It was because he and this golden lion had teamed up. The Twin Stars brothers considered being in a team as their biggest advantage. But this advantage had become a big joke all of a sudden. Other people didn't know the origin of this golden lion, but Yi Shiwen did. Most of the baby beasts that had come out of the eggs of those tyrannical ancient demon beasts had fled when they were back on the demon island. However, a few of these eggs had fallen into the hands of a handful of experts, such as Emperor Qin, Qing Su, Ji Mingyu, etc. Therefore, some of the experts had obtained these eggs of the demon beasts. The demon beasts that hatched out of these eggs possessed unbounded potentials. They also seemed to have extraordinary bloodline, just like the wolf cub. Yi Shiwen had once asked the wolf cub about this. However, the wolf cub hadn't said anything on the subject. To be continued. Chapter 445. Chapter 445. Qin Huang vs. Emperor Qin, Part 3. The wolf cub had always avoided talking about the origins of these baby beasts, as if it was some profound secret. He would never say anything, no matter how much Yi Shiwen asked. The wolf cub's mouth was tightly sealed on this issue. Yi Shiwen couldn't do anything about this matter. The wolf cub had always been carefree. However, he was always clear about what to say and what not to say. Nobody could make him speak if he had decided not to say anything. However, Yi Shiwen was certain that these baby beasts didn't have meager origins. Yi Shiwen recalled the wolf cub as soon as he saw that golden lion. Several years had passed in a wink, and he no longer knew of the wolf cub's whereabouts. He didn't know whether the wolf cub had made the breakthrough into the sage realm or not. However, he could see that this golden lion, that once used to be at the mere truth realm, had reached the peak of the semi-sage realm by now. Therefore, the wolf cub wouldn't have lagged behind either. In fact, he might have progressed even faster. The invincible, imposing aura of the golden lion swept out. Several disciples couldn't help but feel inferior as they looked at this golden lion. There was a difference of heaven and earth between them and that golden lion. The golden lion ferociously trod forward, and the void disintegrated into pieces under his footsteps. It looked towards the sky and roared. The sonic boom perforated in all directions. Qin Huang couldn't sit still when faced with such a powerful golden lion. The origin of his own mount was outstanding as well. It was at the late stage of the semi-sage realm. However, it was still somewhat inferior to this golden lion. So it couldn't help but draw back a step when confronted with the imposing aura of the golden lion. "There's a disparity! Ah!" someone exclaimed. Qin Huang's steed possesses the bloodline of some mythological animal. It's strong enough to crush the common elite. However, there's a clear disparity between it and this golden lion. It may not have fully matured yet. However, it looks a bit weak in comparison. An unsatisfied disciple added with indignation. Yi Shiwen looked. The disciples of the true martial university were unsatisfied since Qin Huang was getting suppressed by Emperor Qin. The real fight is yet to begin, Yi Shiwen calmly noted. In fact, several disciples had made the same judgment as Yi Shiwen. They didn't possess high strength. However, their sharp gazes were still fixed on these two individuals. Neither of the two parties appeared exhausted at this time. This clearly meant that they had reserved their strength. What? They haven't displayed their entire strength? They look so frightening even though they haven't used their entire strength. That microcosm will get smashed into pieces if they went all out. I hope their attacks don't reach the public square. Someone spoke up in astonishment as they heard Yi Shiwen's comment. No, they've displayed their entire strength on one occasion. Yi Shiwen pondered. These experts looked conceited and confident from outside, but they couldn't dare to not use their full strength while facing each other. They wouldn't hold back like they had when they had dealt with ordinary opponents. This was a fight between the experts. Therefore, it would be the end of one if the opponent got even a moment's opportunity. Moreover, there wasn't that big of a disparity between Qin Huang and Emperor Qin. They differed, but only by a bit. Who among these two would dare to be careless if such was the case? That clash a moment ago was only a way to probe each other's strength. The real fight was yet to begin. I'm giving you a chance to go all out. I am told that you possess such strength that you had once wiped out an entire country. Emperor Qin shouted loudly as he remained seated upright on the golden lion. So, I'm giving you just one chance. Reveal your true strength now, or you'll die today. Insolent. He was extremely insolent. It seemed as if he didn't pay attention to a peerless expert like Qin Huang. He would make Qin Huang reveal the entire extent of his strength, and then he would defeat him. This would prove his tyranny. behead a powerful enemy at his best, and prove one's skill. This was the common problem with nearly every powerhouse. They strongly believed that their own way would become even stronger and steadier after they had defeated the powerful enemies who followed a different path. "You'll regret this." Qin Wang replied in a low and muffled voice. It seemed as if his voice was coming from a closed jar, but his voice was ice cold. Nobody knew his current mood. They didn't know whether it was good or bad, since his entire face was covered with a metal mask. The horse he was seated on looked up to the sky and neighed. The sound of its whining shook the surroundings. A terrifying force swept out and opened a crack in the void. It was an exceptional and mythological beast in its own merit. It would have become extremely dreadful if it had reached maturity. Qin Wang took out a scroll from his back. He threw it up in the sky. That very long scroll suddenly went upward and unfolded. It then began to revolve around Qin Wang in a frantic manner, just like a giant dragon. Suddenly, the sound of horses' neigh sounded from inside the page of the scroll and echoed everywhere. A group of cavalry riders appeared before everyone's eyes. They had burst out of the scroll with long spears in their hands. They were clad in iron armors. "These are puppets." Yi Shiwen opened his eyes wide. They looked like humans. However, Yi Shiwen couldn't feel any trace of vitality from their bodies. In other words, these cavalry soldiers were devoid of life. However, they were different from the ghost soldiers that Yi Shiwen had seen in the past, and they were unlike zombies. In fact, he wasn't getting that kind of gloomy and cold vibes from them. They were giving him an ice-cold feeling, just like the one an individual gets from a metal. He wasn't mistaken. They genuinely were puppets. "Aren't these puppets?" many people asked in a doubtful manner. "What is it about this that you don't understand?" These are Qin Wang's mysterious guards. He had wiped out that small country with their help. Someone who knew about them explained, "You're not wrong. These are puppets." However, they become a dreadful army in the hands of Qin Wang. Nobody can resist the might of these mysterious armored guards. Each of these puppets possesses the strength of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. Each of them has condensed more than 800 Tao principles. Each of them is extremely dreadful. Such force is sufficient to sweep away the invincible peers of the same generation. Someone was shocked to find that each of these puppets had terrifying strength. Each of these puppets had condensed at least 800 Tao principles. In fact, some had even condensed 990 Tao principles. This was a very frightening force. There had been a debate since ancient times whether the power of one individual expert was more dreadful or the power of an army. However, no final conclusions had been drawn regarding this debate. There had always been disputes between the arguments about quality and quantity. There had been incidents where an individual had destroyed an entire army, and there had also been incidents where an army had slaughtered an incredible powerhouse. So, there was hardly any way to reconcile these two contradictions. However, these mysterious guards possessed both strength and quantity as far as the present scenario was concerned. There were over 1,000 mysterious guards. There were about 300 cavalry soldiers, 500 infantry soldiers, and 200 archers amongst them. This army was like a flock of sparrows. They were small in numbers. However, they were equipped with all sorts of troop divisions. This explains those widely spread rumors that he had wiped out an entire country once. However, it's not easy to manufacture these sophisticated puppets. It needs excellent skills. Even a sage expert can't handle the massive consumption of energy that's requires in the process. And how did he get so much financial resources? Someone asked. These puppets were extremely powerful. Each of them was at the late stage of the semi-sage realm. Such puppets were spread throughout the true martial world. However, they weren't present in large numbers because they were considered physically weak. Everything depended on the materials that had been used to make them and their cultivation level. They would break easily if their quality wasn't good. However, a huge volume of resources would be required to manufacture super-quality puppets. An ordinary person or even an ordinary force couldn't afford to make such things. Moreover, it would only be fruitful if these puppets were manufactured in large quantities. A single puppet wouldn't give good result. The higher their numbers, the more dreadful they would be. However, the requirement of resources would also increase with the increase in quantity. Therefore, an ordinary person couldn't even dare to think of making them. Only some big forces possessed such huge amount of resources. You may not know this, but Qin Huang is the prince of the Tang Empire. The Tang Empire is one of the biggest empires of the southern region. Moreover, he holds the top position in the empire. So, it's not strange that he possesses these resources. Someone explained he got the title of a Huang because of the authority he obtained when he went on expeditions to expand his empire's territory. Just how much resources would be required to make so many mysterious guards of the late stage of the semi-sage realm? Yi Shiwen couldn't help but hold his breath. Qin Huang had come from a wealthy background. He came from a powerful clan and had the backing of a great force. Yi Shiwen realized that providing for a blood slave had been such a taxing job for him. So, what could one say about providing for 1,000 puppets? One simply couldn't afford it unless one had the backing of a huge force. Yi Shiwen became somewhat envious in his heart. However, he was only envious of the guy, nothing more. After all, he preferred his free life over being part of some big force, since there weren't any kind of restrictions on him. Qin Huang's dreadful army of puppets was frightening enough to scare off people, since they had both quality and quantity. Even a notorious opponent like Yi Shiwen might die if he came across them. This was going to be an amazing gang war. It was hard to predict how Emperor Chen would react. Yi Shiwen looked at Emperor Chen. The man wore a callous smile on his face. He looked at the 1,000 mysterious guards as they advanced towards him. But he didn't do anything to stop them. Is this all you've got? Then the time of your death has arrived. Emperor Chen loudly roared. The energy dissipated in all directions and engulfed everything. The entire world trembled in the wake of his roar. Countless mountains broke down into pieces by the shock of his voice. It was an exceptionally terrifying spectacle. Qin Huang remained calm and collected. However, those 200 archers in the crowd of his mysterious army guards prepared their bows. They effortlessly held the huge arrows in their hands. A person with good eyes could see that each of these arrows was a divine tool in reality. A divine tool was said to be capable to breaking any principle. What can be considered as rich? Well, this could be. Who could dare to be extravagant enough to use divine tools as arrows without the backing and resources of such a huge empire like the Tang Empire? Whoosh! 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 200 long arrows cut through the sky. Each of these long arrows darted forward like a tornado. Those long arrows appeared like long dragons as they raided towards Emperor Qin. Bang! Emperor Qin immediately brandished his long spear. It unleashed terrifying rays of light. It swept down and broke dozens of arrows at once. Those divine tools appeared like a bunch of rolled paper sticks in front of Emperor Chen's spear. Whoosh! 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 The rest of the long arrows struck Emperor Chen's body and produced sparks after they crashed into his fiery red armor and made clang sounds. Those long arrows severed the void around Emperor Chen. These voids had been opened rapidly and were closing slowly. It was an unusually terrifying scene. To be continued. Chapter 446. Chapter 446. Qin Huang versus Emperor Qin, Part 4. Each of these long arrows would have pierced the body of an ordinary expert of the late stage of semi-sage realm and would have crucified them to the ground. In fact, the said individual wouldn't have been able to manage a narrow escape. Qin Huang had once defeated an entire army with the help of these archers. This isn't good enough. Is this all you've got? Emperor Qin burst into laughter and shouted in a cold voice. His spear swept those long arrows away and deflected them. However, 300 cavalrymen with boundless, imposing auras rushed towards him right after that rain of arrows stopped. His voice had barely faded away at this time. There were only 300 cavalrymen. However, it seemed as if they carried the combined, imposing auras of 10 million soldiers. It shook the entire world, and the mountains were left to tremble. This kind of dreadful might could even break the world. Bang! Those 300 cavalrymen had arrived at Emperor Chen's side to kill him in a flash. It seemed as if those riders had integrated to form an amalgam as they concentrated at one place. It had seemed as if they had come on a peerless conquest as they arrived in front of Emperor Chen. These 300 elite riders displayed incomparable might as they dashed forward. They then seemingly combined into one entity. They condensed into a long spear and then swept towards Emperor Qin to impale him. Emperor Qin sneered. He brandished his own long spear, and it collided severely with the incoming attack. Rumble! The entire space once again collapsed and broke into pieces. It seemed as if there was no way the space could have withstood such a terrifying force. This microcosm wasn't strengthened like the space of the metropolis Marshall Peak. In fact, it was extremely easy for the experts of the semi-sage realm to smash the space of such a weak microcosm to pieces. Yi Shiwen's eyes opened wide in amazement. The team of these 300 elite riders had stopped the attack of an expert like Emperor Qin. It wasn't surprising that Qin Huang held the record of annihilating a small country. Such kind of strength was very rare. One always resorts to the thing that works the best for them in a battle, and Qin Huang was at his best in group battles. Annihilating the capital of a country and massacring everyone in the captured cities would have been an ordinary thing for him if his mysterious armored guards had displayed their most terrifying strength while facing the army of a country. These guards were merely at the semi-sage realm. However, Qin Huang would possibly move a step ahead and would form an elite army of sage experts once he had entered the sage realm. Such an army would be sufficient to sweep away everything. The sage realm and the semi-sage realm were two entirely different concepts. So he would require a much higher amount of resources to create sage realm puppets in comparison to the amount required to create these semi-sage ones. However, it didn't matter if he couldn't create an entire army of sage realm puppets. It would be extremely terrifying even if he could create just 1/10 sage realm puppets of the total amount that he possessed at the moment. 100 sage realm experts would be enough to destroy any army. However, Qin Huang somewhat seemed at a disadvantage in this duel. Rumble! A terrifying energy wave came out from the tip of Emperor Chen's spear and scattered in all directions. The energy wave swept across, and the puppets that came in front of it got destroyed in a flash. Bang! 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 Sounds of countless terrifying explosions reverberated. An endless energy storm was set off, and the rock granules were sent flying along with it. It seemed as if these explosions would crush everything. The long spear in Emperor Chen's hands moved as quickly as a dragon and unleashed numerous spear shadows. Each of these spear shadows swept out in the sky at a lightning speed. They then formed a network of densely packed spears. Clang! 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 Each of these spear shadows killed one puppet. Emperor Chen, that's enough! Qin Huang's loud shout sounded from afar. He curled his fingers, and a long bow appeared in his grasp. It was almost the size of a person. He pulled the bowstring, and a huge energy arrow appeared. Whoosh! It went lasing towards Emperor Qin. An incomparably bright light illuminated the surroundings. It streaked through the vast sky and formed a scary fissure in the picturesque sky. Waves after waves of chaos leaked out endlessly from the other side. Bang! That long arrow went straight for Emperor Qin and arrived in front of him almost immediately. However, Emperor Chen looked calm and composed. He lifted his spear and moved forward to welcome the attack. His spear opened its mouth wide like a dragon. It seemed as if it would engulf the long arrow. Bang! The long arrow clashed with Emperor Chen's spear. The tremendous force that resulted from this collision set off a huge storm. The long arrow had contained a dreadful power. Emperor Chen's spear trembled for the first time. His golden lion was also affected by the huge force and roared. Its face looked exceptionally fierce. However, it couldn't resist this terrifying force and drew a step back. Sage tool, that's actually a sage tool. Yi Shiwen immediately recognized the long bow that was in Qin Wang's hand. It was a sage tool. It possessed infinite power. But Emperor Chen's spear wasn't a weak sage tool either. Yi Shiwen had the heavenly source mirror. Other Heaven's Pride experts also had different sage tools. Each of these Heaven's Pride expert was indeed more tyrannical than the other. One must know that many sage experts were still using pseudo-sage tools. However, these Heaven's Pride experts had started to use sage tools. These two individuals had displayed the ultimate might of their sage tools. In fact, they might even be able to face a sage expert if they would show such coordination with their sage tool. They might even face a sage expert at his full strength by burning the primary spirit dawn endlessly. This was the most terrifying thing about sage tools. These two individuals had displayed the power of their sage tools to a horrifying extent. It was much superior to the might displayed by Sun Zhanpeng's long blade. In fact, the extent of power unleashed by these two was far beyond Sun Zhanpeng's reach. Their coordination with their sage tools wasn't as profound as the one Yi Shiwen had with the heavenly source mirror. However, it was still very shocking. Initially, there wasn't a big disparity between these two individuals, and both of them had taken out their sage tools at this moment. So, the disparity between them had shortened even further. One could even fight against a sage expert with a sage tool in one's hand. However, these two were merely top experts of the semi-sage realm. They might die if caught off guard. The one who would be careless would get killed by the other's sage tool, and may end up joining the souls of the deceased. Whoosh! The shrill sound of breaking of space sounded again. The terrifying rays of light emitted and set off a huge tornado. A sharp arrow once again rushed towards Emperor Qin. The remaining 200 mysterious elite riders also dashed towards Emperor Qin to kill him. Meanwhile, the 200 archers had started to shoot waves of arrows. The 500 infantry soldiers who were initially present around Qin Wang had also launched a grandiose attack. Each of these soldiers was at the late stage of the semi-sage realm. The collaborated attack of these many soldiers was bound to be incredibly powerful and scary. How can this Qin Wang be so powerful? I've heard that he wiped out an entire country once. That was already enough to leave everyone in extreme shock. But he's even suppressing a Heaven's Pride expert like Emperor Qin now? In fact, Emperor Qin doesn't seem to have the power to fight back. Qin Wang is too terrifying. Emperor Qin has outstanding reputation. He once killed 2 Heaven's Pride experts at the same time. It's not possible for anyone to suppress a person like him. This is like cheating, a disciple of East Sea's Muddy Sky Island shouted in displeasure. However, he had to face the criticism of many people in return. Only a weak person would say such words. Those puppets were a part of Qin Wang's strength. Anyone could have formed such an army if they had the skill to do so. Even Emperor Chen's mount, that golden lion, had also condensed 999 Tao principles. Wouldn't that be considered as taking unfair advantage? Why didn't they say that Emperor Chen was taking unfair advantage when Qin Wang hadn't displayed his entire strength? However, they had started to complain now. There wasn't anything right or wrong about it. Even luck could be considered as a part of one's strength. And why not? Emperor Chen has been suppressed and doesn't have the power to fight back? What a joke. He'll counterattack soon. Yi Shiwen heard the assessments of those people and sneered. The real fight is going to start now. The long arrow arrived near Emperor Qin in front of thousands of staring eyes. He had been held up by those mysterious elite riders. They weren't worthy of being his opponents, but they were powerful enough to hold him up. The vicious currents produced by the approaching long arrow grazed Emperor Chen's cheeks, and his clothes made fluttering sounds. Whoosh! The golden lion emitted magnificent golden light and disappeared from the spot, along with Emperor Qin. Rumble! Countless attacks landed at the spot where he had stood a moment ago. Qin Huang had bombarded that spot along with those thousands of mysterious armored guards. This attack was equivalent to the joint attacks by hundreds of top semi-sage experts. Bang! The space couldn't endure the devastation and got shattered into small pieces. It was literally reduced to fine powder. It was an exceptionally frightening scene. However, there was no trace of the target. Yi Shiwen noticed something, and Qin Huang obviously hadn't forgotten to pay attention to this either. He frantically scanned the entire place through his mask. Flash! A golden light flashed out of the blue the very next second. Emperor Chen's appeared in front of Qin Huang. He was seated on his golden lion. They were approximately 10 meters away from him. Such distance was far enough for an ordinary person. However, that kind of distance was nothing for an ordinary semi-sage expert. The big personalities seated atop the tall platform saw this scene from inside the clouds that lingered around the platform. They immediately stood up from their seats in shock. What exactly had they seen? They had seen instant transportation. That's right. It wasn't difficult for them to see it when one considers their high martial power. It wasn't that Emperor Chen's movement was too fast and his speed had caused an illusion in the eyes of the spectators. He had actually used instant transportation. This was the space manipulation ability. This had to leave everyone in extreme shock. One must know that there are many principles, but the most mysterious one was the principle of space, besides the time principle. Even the great sage experts couldn't feel and touch the principle of space, and whoever had understood the principle of space had become invincible among his peers. They could travel back and forth in space. This was an ordinary thing for them, and it was nearly impossible to defeat such people. Only a few individuals were born with such talents. Only a few people could understand the principle of space among the billions of people present. And it was possible that one might start using the principle of space at a lower realm. Even Yi Shiwen was inexplicably shocked. He had also seen this clearly. It wasn't hidden from him. He had also seen that the space had fluctuated at that very moment when Emperor Qin had disappeared. This was the ability of space. It wasn't surprising that Emperor Chen had been so confident and had looked down on everyone. Qin Huang responded almost immediately. He picked his bow and twirled his fingers around it as if it were a scissor. He made a series of movements in that very instant. He didn't stop, nor did he show any hesitation. However, Emperor Qin had already arrived very close to him. He wasn't even 10 feet away from him at this time. Whoosh! To be continued. Chapter 447. Whoosh! Qin Huang released the long arrow from his hand. It made a raid towards Emperor Qin, just like a dragon. Flash! Emperor Qin once again transformed into a golden flash and disappeared before everyone's eyes. Bang! The long arrow smashed on the ground and opened a huge crack. Everyone looked more carefully this time. Yi Shiwen again felt the fluctuations in the space. His heart sank. This was indeed spatial ability. This was the most troublesome and thorny matter. The principle of space was second only to the abstruse principle of time in terms of profoundness. Even the great sage experts had no way to feel the traces of this principle. They could feel its traces only if they were born with such talent. Otherwise, they could only use some shallow applications of space principle, since it was difficult to use in actual combat. So, what could one say about disappearing and reappearing anywhere and any time like Emperor Qin could? This wasn't possible for average people. The great sage experts could rip open the void. However, they might get lost in the chaos if they went in. It would then be impossible for them to come out of it without having the coordinates. Coordinates! Suddenly, something clicked in Yi Shiwen's mind. Flash! Emperor Chen had disappeared once again. He appeared behind Qin Wang this time. His long spear struck down to crush Qin Wang like a rolling mountain. Bang! Emperor Chen's attack caught Qin Wang off guard. Qin Wang didn't get enough time to react. He got knocked off from his horse and fell down. He crashed into the ground, and his fall created a huge crater. Even the mysterious guards who were beside him didn't get the time to react. Emperor Chen once again disappeared, and then appeared right above Qin Wang's head the very next moment. He thrust his spear downward towards Qin Wang, as if to stab him to death. Whoosh! A long arrow was once again unleashed, and it went blazing out. It spread brilliant rays of light across the sky, and arrived right in front of Emperor Chen in a split second. However, Emperor Chen disappeared just when it was about to penetrate his body. Qin Wang once again got on top of his horse and sat upright, but he was shivering slightly. Emperor Chen had posed no small threat to his life a moment ago. Everyone was in uproar. They hadn't anticipated the situation to turn into this. Qin Wang had gained the upper hand in the fight a moment ago. However, he had suddenly been forced into a disadvantageous position by Emperor Chen. The two experts no longer seemed on the same level in terms of performance either. A clear disparity had become visible between the two great experts. The expert who possessed the ability of space had turned out to be more powerful one. This was beginning to reflect very vividly and very thoroughly at this moment. Bang! Emperor Chen suddenly appeared behind Qin Wang. His spear struck down upon Qin Wang and struck him on his back. Qin Wang was sent flying once again. His armor got shattered and his blood splattered. Yi Shiwen had come to realize that Emperor Chen didn't possess the spatial ability. Rather, it was the golden lion he was seated on who had this ability. It must have been derived from the bloodline that it possessed. However, what difference would it make? Both of them could be considered as one. Qin Wang didn't stay at one place after he had received this blow, and started to move around at a lightning speed. He would attack at once whenever Emperor Chen appeared. However, he still couldn't restrain Emperor Chen. In fact, Emperor Chen would manage to inflict heavy damage on Qin Wang whenever he'd obtained the slightest opportunity. Some time passed in this manner. Qin Wang's blood splashed, and bone fragments swirled in the air. He no longer had the strength to fight back. The condition of the injuries on his body had become more serious, and his movements had become even slower and sluggish. His entire body was covered with wounds. It was an extremely tragic scene. Emperor Chen's movements had become even quicker, on the contrary, and his attacks had become even fiercer and ruthless. A chill ran inside the spectators who were watching from the observatory microcosm. This was an extremely tragic fight. They had anticipated it to be an evenly matched fight. However, the outcome had turned out to be like this. There was no longer any suspense attached to this fight. It had seemed as if it would be an evenly matched battle. However, Qin Wang's entire body was drenched in blood at the moment. In fact, nearly half of his body had been blown off. However, Emperor Chen was fine. Bang! Qin Wang was once again blasted away. He went flying. His entire arm had been blown to smithereens. Everyone stood up from their seats. Emperor Chen didn't care about Qin Wang's screams, and thrust down his spear. It almost seemed like a dragon. Stop! Even the most calm and composed Supreme Lord of true martial university couldn't help but shout as he realized that Qin Wang was about to get killed. There wouldn't have been any problem if an ordinary Heaven's Pride expert were to die. However, Qin Wang was different. He was a top elite among the Heaven's Pride experts. How could he be compared with an ordinary Heaven's Pride expert? The Supreme Lord's loud shout transformed into a dragon's roar and entered the microcosm. The microcosm trembled under its effect. Emperor Qin heard this. However, he sneered disdainfully and thrust his long spear down. Bang! Qin Huang's body got nailed to the ground along with his mouth. The breeze carried a trace of bloody smell along with it. Qin Huang was dead. Everyone was dumbstruck. They hadn't anticipated that this could be the outcome. Perhaps they had anticipated it. However, they hadn't thought that the fight would end like this. They had believed that perhaps none of these two individuals would win the fight. However, they hadn't expected it to evolve into an entirely one-sided battle. Good, very good. The Supreme Lord took his seat again. He sneered twice and didn't say anything. He must have seen such a tragic scene, the death of his own disciples and that of others, several times in this competition since it was held every 100 years. He had seen so much that he had become too insensitive towards it by now. The Muddy Sky Island's Lord smiled mischievously, unlike the Supreme Lord. However, he didn't say anything. He seemed quite self-satisfied based on the look on his face. This fight had already ended, regardless of whether one was willing to accept this outcome or not. This fight had been the first face-off between the 8 Heavens Pride experts, and Emperor Chen could now be considered as the strongest among them. People had been scared out of their minds after they had watched such an outcome. Everyone had to acknowledge Emperor Chen's strength. Many people had already started to consider him the top expert among the entire range of Heaven's Pride experts. They felt that nobody could match him. Everyone had become quite pessimistic about other contenders after they had watched his spatial ability. How could anybody compete against such a person? Several people felt that Emperor Chen's strength had already surpassed everyone else's. The other fights couldn't attract the attention of most spectators after the fight between Emperor Chen and Qin Huang concluded. The third day's competition came to an end soon after. However, everyone had become even more excited. The fourth day's competition must be countless times more intense than the third day's. Only the experts of the late stage of the semi-sage realm were left in the competition by now. They had gotten to watch the fight between only one pair of Heaven's Pride experts today. However, the fights tomorrow would take place between 3 pairs of Heaven's Pride level experts. The winner of yesterday's contest, Emperor Qin, would face the expert of his own school in the first group. His opponent would be none other than Sea Demon Jin Wushuang. The people of Muddy Sky Island had become restless after they watched such an arrangement of the competition. However, they didn't have any way to express their disagreement. The arrangement of fights was random at first. However, it had been fixed afterwards. Therefore, one could only advance after they had defeated their predetermined opponents. In other words, only one of these 2 famous Heavens Pride experts of the Muddy Sky Island would be able to advance in this time's competition. The fight between these 2 experts of the same sect was one contest, and the second one would take place between Xian Yuan Palace Hall's Twin Stars and True Martial University's Han Bingwang. Han Bingwang was the most low-key and mysterious person among these 8 Heavens Pride experts. It would be impossible to catch a glimpse of him if he weren't fighting in the competition, and he would again disappear after the competition. The bright moonlight in the sky had sprinkled upon the earth tonight. Yi Shiwen lay atop a tall platform on top of the hidden star peak. He was staring at the countless stars that occupied the sky. He was lost in his thoughts. He had arrived at the hidden star peak after he had covered the entire ancient road, and he had done so one step at a time. Nearly 10 years had passed in a flash. Time had disappeared without leaving any trace, just like a white steed flits past a crack. Yi Shiwen had always wanted to return to Earth, so he was practicing as quickly as possible. He wanted to return to the Earth before his parents from previous life would pass away. However, he had come to realize that he had thought it to be a simpler task than it was in reality. 10 years had passed in an instant. He was still somewhat away from the sage realm. God knows when he would find the way back to the Earth. He undoubtedly longed to return to Earth. However, the hope to go and meet his real parents had gradually extinguished. It was needless to mention that he didn't even know where the Earth was located. In fact, he didn't even know whether the Earth was situation in the same dimension or not. Brother Yi. The shadow of a tall person appeared before Yi Shiwen's eyes at this time. Brother Bai. Yi Shiwen sat up from the resting position. Weren't you undergoing closed-door training? Bai Jiansong had already made the breakthrough into the Great Sage realm. However, he had obtained great insights during that fight earlier. Moreover, he wanted to consolidate his newly obtained Great Sage cultivation. Therefore, he had been undergoing closed-door training. Haha, sometimes you have to come out to take a breath of fresh air. Bai Jiansong laughed and said, Congrats, Brother Yi. You have advanced so far in the competition. Why are you congratulating me? I haven't won the championship yet. Yi Shiwen was blunt about it. He and Bai Jiansong had become quite familiar with each other. Yi Shiwen wouldn't have spoken such frank words otherwise. Bai Jiansong just looked at Yi Shiwen. He didn't mind his words. He sat down beside him and replied, There's obviously a reason. Haha, it seems as if Qin Wang's death has affected some old fogies rather strongly. Some people have flown into a rage out of humiliation. The old fogies of Jadeyang Peak are even angrier than the others. Jadeyang Peak was Qin Wang's inheritance. It was also one among the top 10 inheritances. Jadeyang Peak had nurtured Qin Wang as their future hope and pillar of support. They had allowed him to participate in this time's competition so that he could gain some experience. Nobody could match Qin Wang among his peers as per his strength in their opinion. It should have been impossible for anyone to force him to retreat. Who would have thought that Emperor Qin would crucify him on the ground in front of thousands of spectators? Some old fogey told me that they want you to look for an opportunity to get rid of Emperor Qin. You will get a reward of 10 million primary spirit dawn as long as you kill Emperor Qin. This would obviously be separate from the assigned competition's reward. To be continued. Chapter 448. Jadeyang Peak was Qin Wang's inheritance. It was also one among the top 10 inheritances. Jadeyang Peak had nurtured Qin Wang as their future hope and pillar of support. They had allowed him to participate in this time's competition so that he could gain some experience. Nobody could match Qin Wang among his peers as per his strength in their opinion. It should have been impossible for anyone to force him to retreat. Who would have thought that Emperor Qin would crucify him on the ground in front of thousands of spectators? Some old fogey told me that they want you to look for an opportunity to get rid of Emperor Qin. You will get a reward of 10 million primary spirit dawn as long as you kill Emperor Qin. This would obviously be separate from the assigned competition's reward. Bai Jiansong looked at Yi Shiwen with his shining eyes as the corners of his mouth stretched into a smile. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but hold his breath as he heard 10 million primary spirit dawn. The Jadeyang Peak hadn't merely flown into a rage out of humiliation. They had also gone insane in anger. 10 million primary spirit dawn. Obtained that, plus the primary spirit dawn from the rewards of the competition would be enough for him to make the breakthrough into the Sage realm. Moreover, he wouldn't have to be worried about the insufficiency of primary spirit dawn in the process of his breakthrough. Yi Shiwen had obviously become anxious. He was also determined to kill Emperor Qin. Emperor Qin was extremely dangerous for him. Moreover, Emperor Qin had never concealed his hostility and killing intention for him. So, it would be better to root out this source of trouble. However, it could be said that Yi Shiwen didn't really adhere to the pedantic mindset of the best enemy is a deceased enemy, like most people did. He was planning to kill Emperor Qin anyway, and now the Jadeyang Peak had offered him 10 million primary spirit dawn for the same. This was a golden opportunity. Let me tell you, this isn't the highest price they can offer. There's still a margin for negotiation. I can talk to them if you want. Bai Jiansong added, You don't need to. 10 million primary spirit Dawn will do. Yi Shiwen replied, since he wasn't a greedy and insatiable person. The smile came back to Bai Jiansong's serious face when he saw that Yi Shiwen was the kind of person who knew when to stop. People are often unclear about when they should demand more and when they shouldn't. However, you must be careful. I've heard that Emperor Qin possesses the spatial ability. This is an extremely dreadful ability. Bai Jiansong's complexion had turned serious again. Even he had been rendered dumbstruck when he had heard about this. The spatial ability was even rarer than those special physiques. Those special physiques were often traceable. In fact, most special physiques could be traced back to the powerful ancestors. For example, the Titan body was ferocious because his ancestors possessed the blood of Titans. Therefore, his ability could only be considered a result of an ancestral throwback. However, the spatial ability was different. It didn't leave any footprints. Moreover, it didn't appear in certain clans or at certain places. Any person could be born with such talent. However, only a very few such individuals had been discovered so far. Moreover, there were many such lucky people who had remained in the dark about this ability throughout their lives. They themselves didn't know that their body possessed spatial ability. Such people didn't show up often. However, they would turn out to be world-shaking whenever they did. I know. Yi Shiwen nodded and said, but I've discovered that he doesn't possess the spatial ability. Rather, his mount, that golden lion, possesses this ability. There's no difference, even if it is so. Aren't they one instead of two? Bai Jiansong replied. Yi Shiwen wasn't the only one who had noticed this. Bai Jiansong had also felt this. However, it didn't matter whether Emperor Qin possessed this ability or that golden lion. After all, what difference would it make? They were one. That's why he didn't mention the golden lion separately. Even if it possessed extremely tyrannical strength like Emperor Qin, and could alone deal with two ordinary Heaven's Pride experts without any problem. One would be gravely mistaken if one felt that the golden lion possessed the spatial ability and Emperor Qin was nothing. After all, wasn't it Emperor Qin who had subdued that golden lion with the spatial ability? This could be inferred easily. However, he must die because of this. Yi Shiwen was wary of him and considered him as someone that required his attention. This young fellow can't be allowed to go on. Even the high-level experts of our university are as alarmed as the old fogies of the Zhejiang Peak. Our true martial university's well-being may have to depend on his mood in the future if we allow him to mature. Bai Jiansong firmly said. These forces used to conduct such competitions because they themselves wanted to get rid of the Heaven's Pride experts of the enemy forces. These Heaven's Pride level experts didn't pose any threat to them at present, but these forces were already thinking about the future. They clearly knew that these Heaven's Pride experts would become the backbones of their respective forces in the future. Of course, those old guys want you to retreat if you can't get rid of Emperor Qin. The university has already lost Qin Wang, so they will lose everything if they lose you as well. Bai Jiansong added, I also want the same. It won't make any difference if you suffer a temporary defeat at this time. Your road is quite long. There's nothing to be afraid of, even if you lose 10,000 times. You just need to succeed once and deliver him a fatal blow later on. And that would be enough. Are you saying this because you aren't optimistic about me? Yi Shiwen asked somewhat helplessly. However, Bai Jiansong hadn't spoken these words because he wasn't optimistic about Yi Shiwen. He just didn't want to exert too much pressure on him. He felt that it would be better if Yi Shiwen would pull back instead of falling into Emperor Qin's hands. Try to understand. The opposite party has spatial ability. Bai Jiansong didn't deny this fact. Such ability can turn out to be very troublesome, especially in the early phase when only they have the spatial ability and no one else. They have the advantage, and this makes them dreadful. However, some of us will also learn to feel the traces of the space principle later on, and might even devise some method to counter the spatial ability. So, The disparity will decrease very significantly when that time comes. The human body was considered a universe on this road of martial arts, a universe that could be tempered. The so-called theory of having a universe inside one's body genuinely existed. In fact, Yi Shiwen's observing person scripture had been created because of this theory. However, what was the so-called universe? The space and time had been interwoven together to form the universe. This was the innate character of the universe. Space was one of the two biggest constituents of universe. One could gradually start to feel the traces of the principle of space if they reached far enough while practicing on this road of martial arts. And one would be able to comprehend the principle of space to some extent if they were successful. In fact, some people could also devise different methods for counterattacking this principle. The opposite party might have come up with more methods by that time. However, this invisible gap would still reduce rather significantly. Of course, this was true only for a portion of people who'd succeed in developing a deeper understanding of the principle of space. The disparity would only get bigger and bigger for a majority of people. Therefore, Bai Jiansong believed that it would be best if Yi Shiwen would retreat at this time. However, he didn't even think of suggesting Yi Shiwen to admit defeat. That was obviously impossible. The most important thing regarding these Heaven's Pride experts was that they possessed an invincible heart. They weren't like Shuiyan Luo and the others. A permanent flaw would emerge in the martial way of a Heaven's Pride experts if they were to admit defeat even once. And their lifetime's accomplishments would be limited after this came to happen. Qin Wang had died, but he hadn't begged for mercy because of this reason alone. Anyway, even I'm not very much optimistic at this time. Yi Shiwen replied somewhat helplessly. He could also understand Bai Jiansong's thought process. Many people had already considered Emperor Qin as the winner of this competition after he had displayed the spatial ability. Who else could become the champion if not Emperor Qin? The man possessed the spatial ability. Emperor Qin wasn't popular as someone who'd win the competition in the beginning. Rather, Xian Yuan twin stars were. He was at the second place. However, he had suddenly surpassed the twin stars brothers and had become everyone's favorite for winning the competition. This had been an astonishing paradigm shift. However, it had only taken place after Emperor Qin had revealed the spatial ability. Not being optimistic about you is one reason. However, I would also say that it would be better if you don't kill Emperor Qin, even if you have the ability to do so. Bai Jiansong added, Why? Yi Shiwen asked. Emperor Qin was a threat in his opinion, and he would become even more dreadful in the future if he was allowed to mature. So, Yi Shiwen couldn't afford to let him off since he had an opportunity. He must seize the opportunity firmly and give Emperor Qin a fatal blow. You don't understand. You guys have caught the attention of those old guys. Everyone has their gaze fixed on you guys. These people aren't limited to your own force alone. People from the other forces are also present. You must know that all of you are Heaven's Pride experts. Your future accomplishments are going to be limitless, and that's why they care about you even more. Emperor Qin has already become an eyesore for many people. Our true martial university will be watching him closely from now on, and I think even the other forces don't wish to let him off. The Fire Cloud Cave, the Xian Yuan Palace Hall, and even the other forces which currently have no conflict with him must be thinking in this manner, and all of them are regarding him as an eyesore. In fact, the forces that are located in the East Sea would definitely take action against him once the competition ends. Our true martial university may have to live under his shadow in the future if a guy like him were allowed to develop. Similarly, many other people must be feeling a fatal threat from him. Therefore, it's possible that many operations would be directed against him in the near future. Bai Jiansong explained, Emperor Qin is already considered as an eyesore by most people, and you will immediately take his place if you killed him. Then you'd become an eyesore. You will become the focus of all those assassination operations in that scenario, and all sorts of obstacles will start to emerge in your path. And that will basically be the most dangerous time for you. Bai Jiansong explained as he continued. To be continued. Chapter 449. Yi Shiwen didn't say anything. He knew that the champion of this competition would become the target of every big force, and they would quickly try to dispose of him after the competition. In fact, the big forces which had participated in this competition wouldn't be the only ones. The several other forces which had arrived here as spectators would also go after the winner. And this hadn't occurred only once or twice in the past. One would collapse if they couldn't carry this burden. However, one would soar to great heights if they managed to resist these forces. This was an opportunity to strengthen oneself. However, it could also turn into a dead end. Emperor Qin had become an eyesore for everyone the moment he displayed his spatial ability. Everyone believed that Emperor Qin had become a person whom nobody could shake from his position. The high-level experts believed this in particular. However, Yi Shiwen would immediately replace Emperor Qin from his unshakable position if he displayed enough strength to kill him. Consequently, he would become an eyesore for everyone. Let them come if they wish to use some dirty tricks. How will you see the rainbow unless you go through the storm? Yi Shiwen suddenly spoke up. None of their attacks can kill me. It will only make me stronger. A trace of madness flashed in Yi Shiwen's eyes. He wanted to exploit these threats to sharpen his skills and get stronger. He knew that there might be a difference of heaven and earth between him and that ancient phoenix world. He was like an ant on the ground that desired to look up at the divine world in the sky. He must grow stronger, and he must grow up quickly so that he could challenge the sky. How could he say that he would bring Hua Menghan back from the ancient phoenix world if he didn't have the means to withstand these things? Ha ha ha. Good. Interesting. Bai Jiansong clapped his hands as he burst into laughter. He then said, Big Brother had also said the same thing in the past. You two are very similar. Those who wanted to get stronger and stronger until they ultimately became the strongest in the world would have to make this choice. Yi Shiwen wasn't strange if one considered this aspect. One couldn't become the strongest without tempering themselves on the road to invincibility. I won't think twice if I get the opportunity to kill Emperor Qin, and I'm sure that he won't hesitate to kill me either. Yi Shiwen said. He then told Bai Jiansong about the grudges between him and Emperor Qin. He must die, no matter whether it's for that previous resentment from Demon Island, or for this championship. Yi Shiwen looked serious as he spoke. He didn't say anything else apart from this. He would die if Emperor Qin didn't. One couldn't surrender in these fights. The only way to get out of such a fight was to either win or die. Let's not talk about Emperor Qin at this time. You'll have to fight Qi Tian tomorrow. He's not a good guy to mess with either. Bai Jiansong said, Individuals who possess the barbarian god's real body have appeared in every generation of the southern barbarians, and each of them has become illustrious among the disciples of their generation. The barbarian god's real body could be considered as God's special physique. However, it was a man-made technique in reality and could be controlled by humans. 1 or 2 individuals with barbarian god's real body had appeared in almost every generation. In fact, several people with this special physique had appeared on occasions. Moreover, people with barbarian gods' real bodies had appeared in the 100 Barbarian Cave, the Fire Cloud Cave, and other such forces. A fight would break out between these individuals in the event of the situation when several people with the barbarian god's real body appeared, and then a winner would be decided. This winner would then be considered as the strongest person in that generation. People were mostly surprised by the fact that it seemed as if different barbarian gods' real bodies attracted each other. In fact, one could absorb the essence and blood of their enemies with the help of a secret technique, as long as both the fighters possessed the barbarian god's real body after they had killed their enemy. This would make one's blood even thicker and stronger. This would effectively help one become stronger. A southern barbarian person who possessed the barbarian god's real body had appeared once upon a time. He had then killed 10 people who similarly possessed the barbarian god's real bodies. He was finally recognized as the top expert of that generation, and he had emerged as an invincible southern barbarian expert in the future. He had also become one of the top experts in the true martial world at that time. He had even compelled the true martial university to mobilize search parties against him. However, he had suddenly disappeared after many years. The entire true martial world had shaken at that time. This was also the first time when the barbarian god's real body had become famous as one of the strongest physiques. Such a strong bloodline had made the successors of every successive generation exceptionally dreadful. Such an opponent couldn't be called weak from any aspect. I will beat him, no matter what. We can't even talk about dealing with Emperor Qin if I can't beat this guy. Yi Shiwen smiled and replied. His bright smile glittered under the moonlight. Cold wind continued to blow. The night passed away. The highly anticipated 4th day had finally arrived. The fight between 3 pairs of Heaven's Pride experts was going to take place on this day. Many people were contemplating the fight they should choose to see. Which fight would be exceptional? Each of those fights would be stunning in their own merit. So, it would be an extremely unfortunate thing to miss any of these fights. However, the reality had forced them to choose only one fight. So, they chose to watch the fight between Qi Tian and Yi Shiwen. And the moment they had been excitedly waiting for was about to come. The day had finally arrived. The barbarian god's real body was the most tyrannical southern barbarian physique. And Yi Shiwen had killed the one with the titan body in the past. So, he certainly had the most tyrannical physique in the younger generation of the southern region. The clash between the tyrant body and the barbarian god's real body was about to begin. And everyone was looking forward to this fight. One individual possessed the strongest physique of the southern barbarians. In fact, this was the supreme physique of the barbarian god himself. He had left behind too many secrets. In fact, it was said that one could restore the barbarian god's lost prestige if one would cultivate it to the pinnacle. The opposing individual had once defeated the titan body and had practiced an incredible power technique created by some ancient powerhouse. These 2 men are extremely tyrannical. This is a collision between the 2 strongest physiques of the southern region. The sun was shining in the sky. Qi Tian, the owner of the barbarian god's real body, had arrived in the microcosm. He was seated atop an unknown barbarian beast. He held a scarlet lance. Its tip virtually touched the ground. The vicious barbarian aura was sweeping out from his body. It seemed as if the barbarian god himself had reincarnated in the current age. The spectators weren't in the same microcosm, but they could still feel the dreadful fighting strength of the barbarian god's real body. His violent aura had scared everyone, and people had been left to tremble. Qi Tian is the only Heaven's Pride expert to represent the southern barbarians in this competition. However, he possesses the most tyrannical strength. He's also one of the people's favorites to win this competition. His popularity is only behind that of Emperor Qin and the Xian Yuan twin stars. It's difficult to say whether he can rival the strength of Emperor Qin, since that man possesses the spatial ability. However, he's not one bit inferior to the Xian Yuan twin stars. A true martial university disciple made an evaluation. Qi Tian quietly waited as he remained seated atop his mount, the strange barbarian beast. But his exceptional killing intention was gradually sweeping out. This was like watching the scene of a peerless god of war tame the wilderness. He was quietly waiting for Yi Shiwen to arrive. Everyone held their breath, as if their breathing would destroy the aesthetic of this particular scene. The space distorted and a figure arrived. It was an ordinary-looking youth. He arrived in the middle of the arena with small steps. He was Yi Shiwen. Qi Tian's imposing aura had covered the sky, but Yi Shiwen's aura looked too ordinary in comparison. He was clad in ordinary cyan-colored clothes. Even his aura didn't seem to be strong. Ha 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 ha. You've arrived finally. I and many others have been waiting for this day for a long time now. Chi Tian burst into laughter as soon as he saw Yishuan. He looked wild and vicious. He was brimming with arrogance. He had gotten excited after he had seen Yishuan emergence. I've heard that you killed the Titan body. I obviously wanted to kill him too. However, you killed him first. So it will be same if I kill you. Chi Tian's eyes turned red as he looked at Yi Shiwen. The endlessly boiling killing intention was hardly concealed in his eyes. Chi Tian was like a typical barbarian. He considered everyone beneath him. In fact, he was just like Emperor Qin. Perhaps his attitude wouldn't have changed even if Emperor Qin was standing in front of him right now. He possessed a strange type of incredible self-confidence. And he had obtained countless victories because of this self-confidence. Kill me? Who do you think you are? Yi Shiwen sneered. Bang! Yi Shiwen's boundless imposing aura suddenly exploded. It set off a pillar of golden energy into the sky and broke past the clouds. The golden divinities gradually crawled over him and covered his entire body. It seemed as if he was clad in a golden divine robe. Inexhaustible golden divinities condensed under his feet and formed a golden ocean beneath him. The golden rays of light illuminated half the sky. He suddenly started to seem like the god of the golden country. Yi Shiwen had transformed with an explosion, just like a god. Yi Shiwen had gone all out from the get-go. He hadn't underestimated his opponent. Two powerful auras collided in the middle, and neither of the two auras was ready to give way to the other. The space was violently distorted by the collision of these two auras. These two men are extremely dreadful. What kind of power technique has this Yi Shiwen practice that has made him so dreadful? He looks like a god, damn it. A courageous young disciple spoke up. Both of them look like gods. It's like the barbarian god and the golden god are going to fight in the sky. Everyone's even more hyped now. The tall platform was still hidden among the clouds and mist. The supreme leaders of the four major forces were quietly watching this fight between the Heaven's Pride experts. Two Heaven's Pride experts had been allowed to fight together as a team. The so-called Emperor Qin didn't seem affected by this fact. In fact, he had demonstrated the spatial ability and was being considered to be the booked champion. However, the Xianyuan Palace Hall's lord was very confident about the Twin Stars brothers. He hadn't become worried even after Emperor Qin had displayed his spatial ability. After all, his two Heaven's Pride experts would get to fight as a team. They might not be a match for Emperor Qin in their individual accord. However, there wouldn't be any issue if they were to fight together as one. Ha 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 ha. All three Heaven's Pride experts of your true martial universities will be annihilated this time. The Xianyuan Palace Hall's lord burst into laughter as he looked at the supreme lord of the true martial university. Qin Wang had already been impaled to the ground, and Hanbing Wang didn't stand any chance against the Xianyuan Twin Stars as far as he was concerned. Nobody knows till the end, the supreme lord replied indifferently. He was neither sad nor happy. He had seen such battles several times in every 100 years. So these fights between junior experts couldn't move him on an emotional level. And this was despite the fact that he also used to be a young expert once. Don't tell me that you still believe that your disciples can make a comeback? The Xianyuan Palace Hall's lord sneered and said, Your Hanbing Wang is going to be toast, and that Yi Shiwen has only practiced an incomplete power technique. It would have been fine if he had the complete version of that power technique, but it's not a joke to mend a power technique on one's own. How can people of our rank not know how dreadful these ancient power techniques can be? To be continued. Chapter 450. Chapter 450 suppresses Qi Tian. The incredible power techniques of the ancient times held a special position in the eyes of these people. An ordinary person couldn't comprehend and practice these ancient power techniques to their fullest extent. Therefore, the very idea of being able to mend one such ancient power technique was out of question. Even they themselves had failed to do so. After all, how could one trace such fine lines without any guidance? As far as they were concerned, Yi Shiwen had merely patched his power technique, that's all. He wasn't strong. He merely appeared ferocious on the outside like a paper tiger. The Supreme Lord didn't say anything. However, his face exposed a slight trace of a disdainful look. The death of Titan Body would have been pure injustice if Yi Shiwen's strength was superficial like a paper tiger's. In fact, it would have been the biggest injustice ever. Whether he's strong or a paper tiger, we won't be able to know that unless we have examined him properly. Fire Cloud, Caves, Lord sneered and said, Chi Tian's mount, that barbarian beast, was a mysterious creature and nobody knew what it was. It looked exceptionally terrifying. It was exuding the aura of the Beast King. It made people tremble with fear. It was releasing cold energy that was surging up to the ninth heaven. You're quite wild. However, the wildness of a dead person is pretty useless. Chi Tian coldly looked at Yi Shiwen and shouted, Die! The sonic boom dissipated in all directions. He urged the barbarian beast, and it forged ahead. An extremely terrifying energy dissipated in all directions. It seemed as if a barbarian horseman was sweeping across the southern region. He looked enormous and majestic as he rode that beast. In fact, he seemed like a reincarnation of the barbarian god himself. Clang! Yi Shiwen also attacked with all his strength. A long sword condensed in his hand. He poured energy to lengthen the tip of the sword and advanced towards Chi Tian. The void got cut apart wherever the long sword went, and the chaotic energy leaked out. Bang! Both sides ferociously collided. The long sword and the lance knocked against each other. It seemed as if the world would break down into pieces, and the universe would turn upside down. A strange scene appeared in front of everyone. Chi Tian's nearly 10 feet tall figure suddenly collided with Yi Shiwen's slim figure. Logically, Yi Shiwen should have been sent flying off by the collision. However, the clash of these two men seemed similar to the clash of two giant stars. It was a very chaotic scene. It seemed as if the sky and the earth had turned upside down. Chi Tian was surprised to realize that he couldn't suppress Yi Shiwen with pure strength. He had come across such a situation for the first time since he had mastered the barbarian god's real body. These two are equally matched. Yi Shiwen can actually be placed on par with Chi Tian. Someone exclaimed. Nobody knew about Yi Shiwen's tyrant body. However, Chi Tian's barbarian god's real body had been famous for countless years. Therefore, everyone was obviously more optimistic about Chi Tian. A ranking list of disciples had been made before the tournament had started. That list had placed Chi Tian at the 3rd rank. However, Yi Shiwen had been placed at the 5th position, even lower than Qinhuang. You're strong enough, so I can use you like a whetstone to sharpen my skills. Chi Tian grinned. He looked somewhat sinister. He'd actually dare to treat Yi Shiwen as a whetstone. The hearts of several spectators present inside the microcosm shook ferociously. Chi Tian was extremely arrogant. He had dared to consider an opponent of the same level as a whetstone. However, many people also felt that Chi Tian was a very bold and skillful person. They felt that he wouldn't have dared to say such words if he wasn't courageous. Yi Shiwen's eyes had turned ice cold. Chi Tian was indeed very strong. He was a well-known figure among the Heaven's pride experts. He was powerful enough to be ranked as a top expert among his peers. So, Yi Shiwen was extremely glad that this man had considered him as a whetstone for honing skills. Yi Shiwen's golden divinities began to seethe upon his golden body. His golden divine clothes seemed as if they had begun to boil. The golden divine waves under his feet set off a huge tidal wave. Yi Shiwen raised the tip of his long sword and coldly looked at Qi Tian. Bang! Qi Tian moved. His mount looked towards the sky and roared loudly. Its 4 hooves touched the ground, and the space began to tremble. It seemed as if the sky would collapse and fall onto the earth. He rushed forward. His lance was pointed at Yi Shiwen. Qi Tian arrived in front of Yi Shiwen within the blink of an eye. He swept out his lance. The weapon was even longer than Yi Shiwen's height. It seemed as if it would stab Yi Shiwen to death the very next second. However, Yi Shiwen finally moved at this time and brandished his long sword. Clang! A huge explosive sound of the collision of iron and gold metal sounded. The tip of the sword collided with the point of the lance. These 2 men looked like 2 formidable gods fighting on the earth. Both of them retreated several steps under the impact of the terrifying force. The space under their feet broke into pieces as they retreated, and a loud rumbling sound echoed. Their murderous auras overflowed the sky. Their attack power had dropped significantly from the time they had begun their fight. However, their movements were still astonishingly fast. They would use hundreds of moves against each other within a split second. The speed of their movements was comparable to that of lightning piercing the atmosphere. The complementary waves of their fight had bulldozed countless mountains. Their battle had been nothing short of an enormous disaster for this microcosm. In fact, the entire microcosm would soon get smashed into pieces if they weren't careful. Everyone was scared, especially the experts of the younger generation. They found themselves merely mediocre after having watched a fight of this level. Such fighting strength was enough to place them right under the sage realm. However, the younger spectators had merely cultivated for a few years. They were nothing in front of these 2 experts. Clang! The ferocious fight between these 2 men suddenly came to a halt. The lance was trembling in Qi Tian's hand. A terrified look flashed in his eyes. He had fought many people. However, he had become invincible ever since he had practiced the barbarian god's real body. So, most people didn't dare to fight with him, and he had killed his opponents in 1 move even if anyone had dared to challenge him. However, nobody had dared to fight with him the way Yi Shiwen had. He suddenly recalled that the Titan body had died at the hands of Yi Shiwen. He hadn't believed this rumor at first. However, he was finally somewhat convinced that Yi Shiwen could have, killed the Titan body. After all, so many people wouldn't maliciously spread such kind of news if it were false. Damn that rumor. Qi Tian cursed. He had never doubted Yi Shiwen's fighting strength. However, he hadn't believed that Yi Shiwen would possess enough fighting strength to contend against him. After all, most physiques were inborn, and perhaps many other special physiques had been created with the help of systematic methods like Qi Tian's. However, Yi Shiwen's physique wasn't innate. He had cultivated it on his own since he used to be a Hotian expert. Moreover, it used to be an incomplete power technique back then. It was a high-ranked technique that had been created by an ancient powerhouse, but a massive amount of energy must be required to cultivate such physique. He would obviously know this fact because his own physique was acquired, not innate. But how did Yi Shiwen cultivate his physique on his own? What was more terrifying was the fact that he found himself getting suppressed by Yi Shiwen to some extent. Clang! The sound of metallic vibrations spread in the sky. The energy soared to the clouds. Yi Shiwen didn't give Qi Tian any chance to respite, and his long sword immediately swept down towards Qi Tian to crush him. These 2 men had started to resort to extreme methods. They had basically gone all out. It seemed as if each one of their attacks was aimed to kill. There was nothing fancy about these attacks. The long sword in Yi Shiwen's hand wasn't brandishing extraordinary sword moves. It was only unleashing basic sword moves. However, Yi Shiwen's hands possessed incredible might, and it seemed as this might was enough to destroy the heaven and extinguish the earth. He then went towards Qi Tian with such incredible power in an attack. Clang! Qi Tian had no choice but to move forward to face the attack. He couldn't afford to show any weakness at this time. He was guessing that Yi Shiwen would soon get exhausted and wouldn't be able to continue thereafter. But he wasn't up for this kind of a fierce struggle at the risk of one's life. So he would by no means believe that Yi Shiwen was actually feeling more at ease. Bang! 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 Both sides went all out. They didn't use any fancy and gorgeous attacks. It was a collision of sheer powers. No fancy means would last in front of such brute power. Yi Shiwen and Qi Tian were habitual of suppressing their opponents. They would allow their opponents to use 1,000 techniques. However, they would use only one move to crush the opponent. It didn't matter whether their opponent could take their move or not. In fact, an opponent would still fall into their routine if the said individual was able to take their move. However, the opponent would get killed if they couldn't take that one strike. There was no other way. Bang! The two collided once again. Their figures interlocked in midair, and blood splashed out. Everyone stared with eyes wide opened. Who had gotten injured? Everyone was secretly guessing. Who had gotten injured? Qi Tian appeared rather tall when he was seated on his barbarian beast, and the beast was even bigger than him. In fact, they looked like a small mountain. Yi Shiwen was slim in contrast. However, he had given a tough fight to Qi Tian, and his body was also extremely tyrannical. Both these men possessed iron-like bodies. So, who among these two had gotten injured? The movements of these two men had been lightning fast. Most people hadn't been able to track their movements as a result. They had only seen the blood splashing out. So it was hard to tell who had gotten injured. The two men broke the interlock and staggered away from each other. The wind blew and carried a faint smell of blood with it. The tall body of Qi Tian was still seated atop that barbarian beast, but it was shaking and blood was gushing out of his body. Yi Shiwen had opened a huge wound in his chest. In fact, that wound was so deep that even his bones were clearly visible through it. Countless people had opened their eyes wide to see this scene. They didn't even blink. Everyone had been more optimistic about Qi Tian before the fight had started. But they didn't know much about Yi Shiwen's situation. Qi Tian's barbarian god's real body had become famous countless years ago. This had left them to have more confidence in Qi Tian. So, Qi Tian's victory would be a normal scenario in their eyes. In fact, several people had bestowed blind trust in Qi Tian. They had felt that he'd kill Yi Shiwen with a bang. However, the first person to get injured wasn't Yi Shiwen. It had turned out to be Qi Tian. This had left everyone extremely amazed. Qi Tian has sustained injury. How's this possible? Countless people exclaimed with doubts in their hearts. The disciples of the fire cloud cave especially couldn't believe their eyes as they saw this scene unfold. They had been very confident in Qi Tian's abilities. These disciples of the fire cloud cave had seen his might before. He was considered as a top-notch expert in the younger generation of the Fire Cloud Cave. In fact, he had subdued the other Heaven's Pride experts in his sect to earn the big opportunity of participating in this competition. Qi Tian was the only major contestant to participate in this competition from the Fire Cloud Cave side. The first reason behind this was the heavy losses that the Fire Cloud Cave had suffered after they had come under the joint attack of the 100 Barbarians Cave and Devil Worship cult. And the second reason was because he had suppressed the other Heaven's Pride experts. This was also the usual practice for the Southern Barbarians. Only the most outstanding disciples could have the barbarian god's real body among the many disciples, and only the most talented one among them would be trained to cultivate it to the fullest. Qi Tian had participated in this competition to win the championship. He didn't know that he would bump into Emperor Qin and Xian Yuan twin stars here, and would end up being ranked third favorite. And now he had become the first one to get wounded in his fight against Yi Shiwen. My God, how could there be so many evil geniuses? To be continued. Chapter 451. Many disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave were in despair. They hadn't anticipated that such a scene would unfold. They had high hopes for Qi Tian. However, he was the first one to get injured. He was indeed wounded first, but that didn't mean that he had lost. He was representing them. So, they were obviously looking forward to watching him defeat Yi Shiwen without breaking a sweat. However, their wish had become a delusion. This wouldn't have happened if Qi Tian had fully and effortlessly defeated Yi Shiwen. This generation of experts was full of dazzling stars. Nobody knew who was the strongest. It could only be determined after collisions and battles, and the last one standing would be named the strongest. Qi Tian was also somewhat shocked. He was the one to get wounded first. However, the fierce expression returned on his face within a moment's time. His frightening eyes radiated ominous light. He was like a wild beast. The wound on his body recovered, and that too at such a speed that one could see it happening with naked eyes. His healing technique wasn't as fast as Yi Shiwen's Phoenix regeneration technique. However, the restoration capability of Barbarian God's real body was indeed amazing. Yi Shiwen's gilded tyrant form hadn't reached the great completion level yet. It was still in a fumbling phase. He would transform when his tyrant body would reach great completion level. This physique could be only considered as a tough physique at the most. However, he hadn't witnessed a qualitative change in his physique yet. In Yi Shiwen's case, it could be assumed that the attainment of the so-called special physique would come in the form of genetic mutation. The genes in his body would transform when his tyrant body would reach the great completion level, and then it could even be passed on to the next generation. Maybe his tyrant body would have its own passage down the generations at some time in the future. However, it was uncertain whether he would be considered as the ancestor. His tyrant body was far from reaching the great completion level at this time. It was described in the secret book of tyrant body technique that the practitioner would be able to tear apart even the gods and devils with bare hands after they had reached the great completion level. However, the great completion level seemed a bit far-fetched at present. Even so, his physique was already very intrepid. "You're the first person who has managed to injure me ever since I've attained the Barbarian God's real body." Qi Tian sneered coldly and said, "I'll be also the first and only person to kill you." The sword in Yi Shiwen's hand let out a metal clanging sound. The tip of the sword suddenly emitted dreadful light rays. He had only intended to show off his ability, and the released sword intention was quite formidable and pressing in nature. Everyone was scared. Yi Shiwen's imposing aura had suppressed everyone. They could even feel it from across a different microcosm. This had left them very scared since it had been coupled with the fact that he had injured Qi Tian a moment ago. Yi Shiwen's overall might and influence had increased a lot as a result. Qi Tian urged the barbarian beast, and it rushed straight towards Yi Shiwen. His lance pierced through the sky and released countless lance shadows made up of Tao. It streaked across the horizon and tore innumerable cracks in the sky. All sorts of divine beams fluttered about in the sky. The lance shadows condensed into an image of the barbarian god behind him, and they together went towards Yi Shiwen to suppress him. This was the ancient legendary lance, named God Killer Lance. It had been handed down by the ancients as per the legend, and the barbarian god had once used the set of this lance's technique to slay the gods. It was extremely terrifying. The lance shadows formed a great wall. This was seemingly covered the entire sky. Then, it swept down towards Yi Shiwen to crush him. It seemed as if it would crush Yi Shiwen to death. Yi Shiwen's complexion didn't change one bit. He raised his long sword to welcome the incoming attack. Meanwhile, he unleashed the observing person scripture. The stars began to revolve around in his background. They appeared like the real universe. It seemed as if an ancient voice that had existed since time immemorial was chanting the observing human body as universe scripture, word by word, and phrase by phrase within Yi Shiwen's body. One could even feel the inner essence of great Tao in this chant. Yi Shiwen's display seemed like a glittering river of stars. It was pouring down from the sky. This was Yi Shiwen's self-made move of the observing person scripture. But it was merely in its development phase, nothing more. However, it was still incredibly dreadful. One side of the sky was covered with an incredible martial art that had once been unparalleled in the ancient world. And the other side of the sky was covered with a martial art which was created by Yi Shiwen. Then an astonishing collision occurred in the sky. Rumble! The inexhaustible rays of light transformed into energy waves and set off violent storms everywhere. The space had already been smashed to pieces. This already shattered space couldn't withstand this collision either. It got smashed even more badly and scattered. Yi Shiwen's sword, just like a galaxy, slashed down upon Qi Tian's body. The 4 hooves of the barbarian beast couldn't withstand the force and got fractured. Its 4 legs bent and it crouched down. The hearts of several spectators thumped. They were looking at these 2 men and they were dumbstruck. This battle had become too intense. These 2 men looked like gods to them. The invincible God-Killer lance had wreaked havoc in the past, but it had shriveled in front of Yi Shiwen. Actually, its invincible temperament had been gradually chopped down by Yi Shiwen, 1 sword strike at a time. Qi Tian's 999 Tao principles began to revolve around his body in a crazed manner. Each of these Tao principles could easily crush a semi-sage expert to death. This was a terrifying power. Then Qi Tian unleashed his utmost power. Qi Tian's complexion had turned exceptionally solemn. He had never given much importance to Yi Shiwen. In fact, he still felt that he wouldn't have been accidentally wounded by Yi Shiwen if he had displayed his full strength from the start. However, his contempt towards Yi Shiwen's skill set had vanished. It had been replaced by a dignified look. He had reached the pinnacle of the realm he was in. He effortlessly brandished his lance. The lance tore open the space along with an ear-piercing sound. The sky couldn't endure this attack and got smashed into pieces by the lance energy. It was an extremely terrifying scene. It looked like the doomsday. Yi Shiwen's imposing aura was rising unceasingly. His 999 Tao principles soared up and began to revolve around his body. Yi Shiwen sneered and spoke, "Is this all you've got?" Qi Tian's imposing aura had already reached the peak of his level. However, Yi Shiwen's imposing aura was still rising unceasingly. So it became difficult for Qi Tian to conceal the look of panic in his eyes. How's this possible? How's his aura still rising? Qi Tian had believed that his aura had already reached the peak of the semi-sage realm and couldn't have risen any further. However, Yi Shiwen made him realize that he was gravely mistaken. It was Yi Shiwen who had reached the peak, not him. Yi Shiwen's aura didn't continue to rise all the way. It was still 1 step away from reaching its peak condition. But he didn't wish to reveal his entire strength. Buried heaven's sword. Yi Shiwen's sword slashed out a galaxy. The seemingly endless void got chopped into 2 halves by the sword energy. The terrifying force struck down towards Qi Tian to crush him. It was like a thunderbolt. How could Qi Tian be willing to resign without a fight? His lance went piercing through the horizon and erupted. The force with which the energy was released by this intense eruption was incredible. It seemed as if it had arrived straight from the wilderness. Bang! Terrifying shock waves swept out swirling in the air from the collision point of the 2 weapons. Puff! Qi Tian spouted a mouthful of blood. This was a result of the internal injuries that had been caused by the shock. Everyone was nearly scared to death. Yi Shiwen's strength was intrepid to a dreadful extent. Most people had never seen anyone damage Qi Tian's internal organs. One must know that they wouldn't have been baffled if someone of a higher level had injured him. After all, there were certainly more tyrannical persons than him out there. However, He had been injured by the dreadful power of a person of his rank. Something like this had never happened. Crunch! The barbarian beast's two hind legs couldn't withstand any longer and fractured. It screamed loudly and fell to the ground. Yi Shiwen made another sword strike at this time, and his long sword fluttered among the stars like a dragon. Clang! The long sword struck the tip of a lance. The intense sword energy released its suppression effect on Qi Tian. His long hair had been left to flutter in the air by the sword strike. Bloody scars appeared on his tough skin, even though it was supposed to be as hard as iron and gold. This had been caused by the crushing impact of the tyrannical sword. Blood splashed out from the hand in which Qi Tian held the lance. This had been caused by the tremendous power of the sword attack. Even his mount's body got cracked as a result. Qi Tian promptly left his mount. He now stood on the ground and held the lance in his other hand. He coldly looked at Yi Shiwen. He had become extremely vigilant in his heart. Yi Shiwen's performance had been incredible so far. He had resorted to extreme methods in response. However, Yi Shiwen had still turned out to be far more dreadful. It seemed as if there was no bottom line to his strength. Each of his sword strikes turned out to be far more tyrannical than the previous one. Each sword strike was more tyrannical than the other. So, Qi Tian would soon get chopped in half if he allowed Yi Shiwen to make such sword strikes again and again. In fact, he wouldn't even get a chance to fight back at this rate. Such a power, which had a gradient rise, was bound to be baffling for a person like Qi Tian, whose forte had been the use of brute force. This was actually Yi Shiwen's highly perfected cold moon beheader technique, and its essence was integrated with his swordplay. There was no longer the limitation of using just one sword style in a sword strike for the current Yi Shiwen. Basically, he had grasped many sword styles, and they were all at his fingertips. In other words, he could readily use the essences of thousands of different sword styles in one sword attack. Yi Shiwen had already achieved such a dreadful position. He continued to unleash one sword strike after another, and the cumulative power of the sword attack grew dramatically as a result. And it seemed as if Qi Tian would be chopped into two halves any time. The sword struck Qi Tian's barbarian beast. It was already in a seriously injured state. It collapsed on the ground. However, Yi Shiwen didn't stop. His long sword fell down from the sky like a stream of Star River. It appeared similar to a perpetually flowing river. Qi Tian suddenly noticed some change in the flow of river. An endless stream of stars suddenly burst out from a certain point in the universe. They didn't seem just like a galaxy, but they also looked like a perpetually flowing river. Bang! Yi Shiwen's sword struck upon Qi Tian's lance, and blood splashed out from Qi Tian's hands. His palms were badly injured and had been covered with blood. The flesh on his hands had been ruptured by this terrifying force. This was the first sword strike. Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. It was then followed by the second sword strike. It exploded into brilliant rays of light, and they swept across in a flash. Yi Shiwen then brandished yet another sword strike. He didn't give Qi Tian any chance to respite. Each of these sword attacks was more tyrannical than the other. It seemed as if these sword attacks were cumulative and superimposing in nature. Clang! The sound of the collision of metals was mixed with the sound of breaking bones. The bones in Qi Tian's hands had been broken by Yi Shiwen's sword attack. How's this possible? The Fire Cloud Cave's lord was seated on one of the 4 thrones that had been placed on top of the tall platform, hidden among the clouds and mist. He suddenly stood up from his throne with a look of disbelief in his eyes. He had helped Qi Tian build his barbarian god's real body. Therefore, he clearly knew how dreadful this barbarian god's real body was in reality. He himself possessed the barbarian god's real body. This kind of strong physique was truly scary. Even the strongest barbarian beast of the southern barbarian region wasn't a match for the barbarian god's real body when it came to pure, competitive strength on the same cultivation realm. The toughness of this physique was top-notch. However, Yi Shiwen had overwhelmingly routed Qi Tian's counterattacks by using brute strength alone, and the shock generated from his sword attack had even broken his hands. This scene was seriously too scary. Qi Tian snorted in a distressed state. He frantically retreated in order to dodge the next wave of Yi Shiwen's attacks. However, how could Yi Shiwen allow him to have his wish? His sword slashed towards him. Qi Tian had no means to resist Yi Shiwen's attack this time. "Don't do it!" An extremely vigorous and forceful shout sounded inside the microcosm. However, Yi Shiwen's sword didn't stop. It vigorously slashed down. Puchi! Qi Tian had been cleft into two. The blood splashed, and bits of his flesh and blood splattered across. To be continued. Chapter 452. Silence. There was pin-drop silence. Nobody had anticipated that this could be the outcome. Qi Tian had been overbearing. He had suppressed the peers of his generation of the Fire Cloud Cave in order to participate in this competition. So, he had arrived here with the thought of winning this championship. The owners of Barbarian God's real body had become champion many times in the past. However, he had been killed by Yi Shiwen's sword. It was an extremely miserable situation. The Barbarian God's real body had won this championship countless times in the past. They at least hadn't been killed, even if they hadn't won the championship. And none of them had been crushed like this without having any power to fight back. Yi Shiwen had nearly made the history in this generation. This generation's Barbarian God's real body wasn't the weakest, just like the Barbarian God's real body of the past generations. It was above average, to say the least. However, Yi Shiwen had swept him away as if he was nothing, and had eventually killed him. In fact, Qi Tian couldn't even match Yi Shiwen, apart from the beginning of the battle when they were probing each other's strength. Good. Very good. The complexion of the Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave had turned grim. He sat down after he had watched this scene in front of him and had spoken with a sneer. The Supreme Lord of the True Martial University still had no expression on his face. Nobody knew what he was thinking. He was neither happy nor angry. However, the face of the Lord of Muddy Sky Island exposed the trace of a shocked expression. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen could have such strength. However, a calm expression quickly got restored on his face. He still had a lot of confidence on Emperor Qin. After all, Emperor Qin possessed the spatial ability. So, he already stood at the invincible position. Yi Shiwen was certainly very powerful, and he had acquired a whole new level of respect and admiration in his eyes by now. However, he wasn't anxious even now. The Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall was seated beside him. He seemed to be feeling very disgusted, on the contrary. It seemed as if he had eaten a cockroach. His facial expression had turned ashen. He had been extremely excited a moment ago. He had even gone out of his way to say that Yi Shiwen wouldn't be able to win, and that all the experts of the True Martial University would be eliminated from the competition. However, he hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would give a tight slap on his face not long after this declaration of his. In fact, Yi Shiwen had shown him stars in bright daylight. He had also said that Yi Shiwen wasn't a match for Qi Tian and would get killed. However, the situation had reversed. Yi Shiwen hadn't died. Rather, Qi Tian had. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had displayed formidable fighting strength. So he had gotten scared in his heart. He wasn't calm and composed like the Lord of the Muddy Sky Island, because Twin Stars brothers didn't possess spatial ability like Emperor Qin. So they weren't standing at the invincible position like Emperor Qin. Yi Shiwen had won. So the Twin Stars brother would face Yi Shiwen in the next fight if they would also win this round. This had already been decided by the competition's chart. The more formidable strength Yi Shiwen would reveal, the more dangerous that would be for the Twin Stars brothers. The complexion of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord turned exceptionally ugly as he thought about this. I hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen would win. What did you not expect? Each of these heaven's pride expert is more powerful than the other. It's quite normal for any of them to win. Who knows what kind of strength they must be hiding deep down? Had you thought that Emperor Chen would possess spatial ability before his fight with Qin Wang? You hadn't thought that Yi Shiwen could effortlessly defeat Qi Tian, but he ultimately killed him. Yeah, Qi Tian and Qin Wang were completely different from each other. Qi Tian had been ranked below the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers and Emperor Qin. However, Yi Shiwen has managed to defeat him in an effortless manner. Yi Shiwen's strength is truly intrepid. In fact, it's simply beyond your imagination. And just look at him. He looks quite relaxed. It's obvious that he hasn't used his full strength. So, it's too early to say who would win this competition. The disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave felt extremely disheartened after they witnessed the death of Qi Tian at the hands of Yi Shiwen. The Fire Cloud Cave's run in this competition had come to an end along with Qi Tian's defeat. Yi Shiwen had smoothly entered the semifinals after he had killed Qi Tian. He had now become one of the top 4 contenders, while Qi Tian had gotten eliminated from the competition in the quarterfinals. And most importantly, the disciples of the Fire Cloud had seen this battle with their own eyes. Yi Shiwen hadn't used any tricks. He had thoroughly defeated Qi Tian using pure strength. This had left them speechless. They obviously didn't wish to admit this. However, they couldn't say anything against Yi Shiwen at this time. Yi Shiwen had thoroughly established his might and influence in this fight. Nobody dared to look down upon him anymore. Initially, people were only talking about Emperor Qin or Xian Yuan twin stars brothers when they were debating the winner. However, they must add Yi Shiwen in that list now. Moreover, the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers were Yi Shiwen's next opponents. The list of the 4 semifinalists was out. In fact, Yi Shiwen wasn't the one to end this round at the earliest. Rather, it was Emperor Qin. Emperor Chen's opponent was Si Demon Jin Wushang. Both of them belonged to the same sect. Therefore, these 2 men didn't fight. Si Demon Jin Wushang merely laughed and surrendered. The fight didn't even take place. Consequently, Emperor Qin won the fight at the earliest. This was followed by Yi Shiwen. He had effortlessly defeated the incredibly strong Qi Tian. Everyone had been very optimistic about the Xian Yuan twin stars in their fight against Han Bingwang. However, they had to struggle a lot. He had always been low-key and mysterious, even more so than Yi Shiwen. However, it was hard to get hold of him, and he disappeared right after his fight ended. He had displayed tyrannical strength this time. The Xian Yuan twin stars brothers had to go through a lot of trouble in this fight. The microcosm had nearly collapsed under their fight. They had eventually managed to defeat Han Bingwang. However, they couldn't kill him. In fact, several people said that the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers wouldn't have been a match for Han Bingwang if they had challenged him 1-to-1 instead as a team. This rumor made the most noise, even more so than Emperor Qin, even though he had advanced easily after Si Demon Jin Wushang had surrendered, or Yi Shiwen, who had effortlessly defeated Qi Tian. In addition, Emperor Qin had easily crushed Qin Wang in the previous round. That was also the first time a Heaven's Pride expert had been defeated. But it could be said that the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers had to face a lot more difficulty to reach the semifinals compared to Emperor Qin and Yi Shiwen, since they had won effortlessly. And it could be said that the presence of Yi Shiwen could increase the obstacles on the twin stars brothers' way to win the championship. Many people were secretly gambling in the True Martial University. The rate of Yi Shiwen's victory had already surpassed that of the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers. This also indirectly meant that everyone wasn't optimistic about the victory of Xian Yuan twin stars brothers anymore. It was even more so because the semifinals were tomorrow, and the 4th semifinalist was a dark horse. Nobody had heard of him. He was a disciple of the True Martial University. His strength was equal to a quasi-Heaven's Pride expert's. It must be said that he was very lucky that he had reached till here. The debate on who would win and who would lose had become even more intense after the competition had reached the semifinals. The underground gambling houses had especially turned even livelier. These underground gambling houses had the support of a myriad of forces of the true Marshall University behind them. Hence, the higher authorities had turned a blind eye to them, even though they operated in public. Come, we're going to start now. Bet on Yi Shiwen. The rate is 1 if he wins and 1 if he loses. Bet on the Xian Yuan twin stars. The rate is 1 if they win and 1. 5 if they lose. A disciple was announcing the biggest handicap bet on the Metropolis Marshall Peak. Many disciples were watching him attentively and were watching the other disciples place their bets. The disciples were present in the surroundings, also went ahead and placed their bets. The disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave, the Muddy Sky Island, and the Xian Yuan Palace Hall were also among them. However, the majority were the disciples of the true Marshall University. Almost all the disciples of the true Marshall University had unanimously bet for Yi Shiwen's victory. Yi Shiwen was the only Heaven's Pride expert of the true Marshall University who was still in the competition. Another disciple of the true Marshall University was also in the competition. However, they could tell that he wasn't a match for Emperor Chen. The strength of a quasi-Heaven's Pride expert was way below Emperor Chen's. In fact, the difference was so huge that the betting for Emperor Chen's semifinal match didn't even open. There wasn't any suspense in that battle. The dealer would go bankrupt if he were to open the betting for that match. In other words, it was certain that the finals would take place between Emperor Chen and Xian Yuan twin stars brothers, or Yi Shiwen, and that was dependent on the battle between Yi Shiwen and the twin stars brothers. However, it was evident from the odds that everyone was more optimistic about Yi Shiwen's win. However, the disparity between them wasn't very big. Many people had also bet on the Xian Yuan twin stars win, especially the disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace. Nearly all of them had unanimously bet on the Xian Yuan twin stars win. They were determined to have their revenge on Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen's rank had progressed by 1 position after he had effortlessly defeated Qi Tian. He was now second only to Emperor Chen. I placed my bet on the Xian Yuan twin stars. They've come very far. That Yi Shiwen is like a feather in front of them. He's just an upstart. A disciple of Xian Yuan Palace Hall spoke angrily. The Xian Yuan twin stars used to be everyone's favorites to win the competition until Emperor Chen hadn't displayed his formidable fighting strength. After all, there are 2 men fighting as a team. So, they had been hot favorites to win this competition. However, Emperor Chen had become everyone's favorite after he had displayed his spatial ability. It would be a light if Emperor Chen had become everyone's favorite. After all, he had displayed the spatial ability. He stood at the invincible position as a result. So this was quite normal. However, Yi Shiwen was nothing. He had only defeated Qi Tian, that's all. In fact, Qi Tian had been placed below the Xian Yuan twin stars in the rankings. So, Yi Shiwen's name didn't have to be placed above the Xian Yuan twin stars, even if he had defeated Qi Tian. The twin stars brothers were 2 individuals at the end of the day. However, even that Xian Yuan Palace Hall disciple might not have noticed when his confidence on the twin stars brothers and his expectations with them had got stuck to only 1 point. The Xian Yuan's twin stars were 2 men, and Yi Shiwen was alone. Initially, he had thought that they were powerful enough as a team to sweep away their peers. However, he suddenly felt that having more number of people wasn't advantageous anymore. Emperor Qin had used his spatial ability to defeat Qin Wang's counterattack with ease, and Yi Shiwen was so tyrannical that he defeated Qi Tian effortlessly. Both of them had displayed top-notch strength that was far above their peers. However, people generally talked about the 2-to-1 accomplishments when it came to Xian Yuan twin stars. They had greatly benefited from this thus far. However, people were still not very optimistic about them. When did they get reduced to such an extent? To be continued. Chapter 453. The complexions of the Xian Yuan's twin Stars brothers had turned ashen when they saw this scene unfold at the gate of the gambling house. This situation had appeared right after their fight. They, like everyone, had abandoned them. They felt like they had been thrown away like a pair of tattered shoes, as if they were of no use whatsoever. Yi Shiwen, it's because of that Yi Shiwen! The twin Stars brothers clenched their teeth and spoke up in unison. Their complexions had turned sinister. So, it is the Xian Yuan's twin Stars brothers! A somewhat mocking voice sounded from behind them. They turned around to look and saw a young man clad in cyan-colored clothes. He was looking at them with a bright smile on his face. Yi Shiwen, it's you! The twin Stars brothers shouted angrily. They had identified this man, and it was none other than Yi Shiwen. I didn't expect to see you here. I guess it's true that enemies often cross each other's path. Yi Shiwen faintly laughed and said. Then he walked past the twin Stars brothers. The complexions of the twin Stars brothers turned pale as they saw Yi Shiwen. They clenched their teeth so tightly that it seemed as if they would break down. They glared at him with extreme hatred. This was a huge humiliation for them. They wouldn't have faced such humiliation if Yi Shiwen hadn't been there. This was even worse than death for them. However, they had no choice but to watch helplessly as Yi Shiwen walked past them. They couldn't do anything. They could only watch him walk past them. However, they couldn't see that Yi Shiwen had secretly clenched his fist to guard himself against any sudden attack. He was prepared. In fact, he would have killed them on the spot if they had attacked. However, they didn't attack in the end. So Yi Shiwen relaxed. However, he was also somewhat disappointed. Can I bet? Yi Shiwen walked up to that disciple who was managing the betting and asked, Brother Yi? That disciple couldn't believe his eyes when he saw Yi Shiwen here. Of course. Even a person like Yi Shiwen wanted to bet. What could one say about the others? I bet on my own victory. Yi Shiwen calmly said. That is natural. How much does Brother Yi wish to bet? The disciple asked. Yi Shiwen would obviously bet on his victory. That was a given. That disciple knew that very well. There was no doubt about it. 3 million primary spirit dawn. Yi Shiwen replied. What? 3 million primary spirit dawn. That disciple was suddenly dumbstruck. An ordinary semi-sage expert would belong to the very rich category if he had 100,000 primary spirit dawn. And those who had more than 1 million primary spirit dawn were rarely found in the semi-sage realm, let alone 3 million primary spirit dawn. There wasn't any other person in the semi-sage realm who could have so many primary spirit dawn apart from Yi Shiwen. There were many people who had a wealth of more than 1 million primary spirit dawn. However, that also included different kinds of divine tools and heavenly treasures. Only Yi Shiwen could have such courage to throw away an astronomical amount of 3 million primary spirit dawn apart from the sage experts, of course. Moreover, any rare personality who had accumulated so many primary spirit dawn wouldn't dare to bet the entire amount in one go. That's because one would lose everything if they lost the bet. Such a huge loss would be enough for a semi-sage expert to commit suicide. Yes, 3 million primary spirit dawn. Yi Shiwen confirmed. The onlookers gasped in admiration as they looked at Yi Shiwen. They couldn't believe that he had bet 3 million primary spirit dawn on his own victory. It indicated that he was very confident. Yi Shiwen looked calm, not because he had a lot of confidence in himself, but because he had no other choice. He had to go all out no matter whether it was against the Xian Yuan twin stars or Emperor Qin. There could only be two outcomes. Either he would kill both of them, or one of them would kill him. These primary spirit dawn would be of no use for him if he were to get killed. However, he would obtain an astronomical amount of primary spirit dawn if he were to succeed in killing them. He would obtain two major rewards as a result. One was an amount of more than 10 million primary spirit dawn he'd get if he won the bet, plus a reward of 10 million primary spirit dawn which he'd get from the Jade Yang Peak. Then he would get rid of the future problem of the shortage of primary spirit dawn in fell swoop. That's all. That disciple thought that he wouldn't reject any bet irrespective of the amount. After all, Yi Shiwen was a guest at the moment. He was more dazzling than everyone else, but there was no reason to turn him away since he was a guest. I wish to bet 500 primary spirit dawn. Put 100 under my name. I want to bet 1,000. The disciples who were merely waiting and watching until now also stepped forward and started to place their bets once they saw that Yi Shiwen was so confident about himself. Yi Shiwen was practically the biggest party involved in this gamble. However, he had dared to bet 3 million primary spirit dawn on his own victory. Therefore, they had no reason to not bet. The disciples of the true Martial University especially contributed even more generously in Yi Shiwen's favor. On the contrary, the disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall got very depressed when they saw the true Martial University's disciples betting before their eyes. They said, "Humph, all of you will cry bitterly soon." These disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall looked towards the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers. The two of them were standing at the gate. They were expecting these two brothers to declare their position as well. These disciples would like to support these two brothers if they would compete against Yi Shiwen in this aspect. In fact, these disciples wouldn't mind even if they lost some money over this gamble. After all, they belonged to the same force as these brothers. The Xian Yuan twin stars realized that everyone was staring at them. They didn't know why, but they immediately felt a bit depressed. They imagined themselves throwing away several million primary spirit dawn recklessly. However, the very thought of it paralyzed them. After all, it wasn't a few million spirit stones. It wasn't a few million spirit dawn. It was a few million primary spirit dawn. They wouldn't be worth so much even if they were to sell themselves off. These two brothers had the combined wealth of merely 1 million primary spirit dawn, and their divine tools and heavenly treasures were included in that wealth. So, they wouldn't be able to surpass Yi Shiwen's bid even if their entire wealth would be converted into primary spirit dawn. They differed significantly from Yi Shiwen in terms of wealth. They would only see themselves become a laughing stock in front of everyone, even if they were to throw away everything they possessed. And then they would end up being ridiculed by Yi Shiwen. They would hardly obtain any benefits from it as a result. Their state could only be described as depression. After all, from where did Yi Shiwen obtain so many primary spirit dawn? The true Martial University wouldn't have given him so many primary spirit dawn even if he was a Heaven's Pride expert. That was simply irrational. They thought that Yi Shiwen must have obtained some rewards from the true Martial University. After all, their income mostly came this way. However, they didn't know that Yi Shiwen had obtained the majority of his wealth through a myriad of methods. It wasn't given to him as a reward by the university. Yi Shiwen's energy consumption was huge. How could his cultivation speed have been so fast if he had only depended on the university's rewards and monthly income? He would have been lingering in the half-step legendary realm even now if he had depended on the university alone. They felt like throw away a huge amount too. However, they would be embarrassed in front of Yi Shiwen if they couldn't surpass the mark of 3 million primary spirit dawn. The two brothers shared their feelings with each other. They then came to a mutual decision, turned around, and left. They ignored the ardent gazes of countless disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall behind them as they left. Their ardent looks couldn't make these two brothers to lose face in front of everyone. "Yi Shiwen, you'll regret this!" The Xian Yuan twin stars brothers gritted their teeth in rage as they spoke. They ferociously thought that they must humiliate Yi Shiwen in the battle. The disciples of the true Martial University made a huge noise as soon as they saw the twin stars brothers retreat in defeat. They had faced a lot of taunts and scorching satires from the disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall due to these twin stars brothers. They had been insulted even more after the defeat of Qin Wang and Hanbin Wang. However, They were feeling proud and elated at the moment. What's great about the twin stars brothers? What's rich about them? This is what it means to be rich. Whom are they calling an idol? This is how an idol should be. Yi Shiwen had thrown away 3 million primary spirit dawn in one breath. Whoever dared to challenge him would get a slap on their face. This was 3 million primary spirit dawn. Many sage experts didn't have such wealth. Perhaps Yi Shiwen would have drawn several sage experts to trail behind him if he had revealed his wealth at a place other than the true Martial University. It might be an astronomical wealth for other people. However, even this amount of primary spirit dawn was insufficient to cultivate to the sage realm as far as Yi Shiwen was concerned. His strength was very tyrannical. However, this was truly an endless pile of primary spirit dawn. This statement was no exaggeration. Yi Shiwen could do anything in this world with so many primary spirit dawn in his hand. This wasn't a joke. He could match the speed of exceptional talents in making breakthroughs as long as he had a guaranteed supply of primary spirit dawn. He could even surpass those heaven's pride experts without any problem. Many disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall became very depressed as they saw the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers leave. And they had no choice but to leave dejected as the cheering voices and mocking laughters of the true Martial University's disciples turned louder. On the other side, the complexions of the disciples of the Muddy Sky Island and the Fire Cloud Cave had become complicated as they saw this scene. It could be said that there were negligible grudges between them and the true Martial University, especially when compared to the hatred between the Xian Yuan Palace Hall and the true Martial University. The disciples of the Muddy Sky Island had a lot of confidence on Emperor Qin. It didn't matter to them how strong Yi Shiwen was. Many people among the disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave were watching Yi Shiwen with immense hatred. Yi Shiwen had killed Qi Tian, and they had lost their hope of winning this competition because of that. They had been turned into mere spectators among the four forces as a result. They could only see the fight between Yi Shiwen and the Xian Yuan twin stars and Emperor Qin. However, Yi Shiwen didn't care. He had prepared himself for these things when he had decided to kill his opponents to win this championship. The so-called the taller trees in a forest are always the first to be blown by the wind. However, it was finally the time to see what was stronger, the wind or the forest trees. Not being infected by jealousy was mediocrity. The news about Yi Shiwen spending 3 million primary spirit dawn in the gambling house had quickly disseminated everywhere. However, this was merely an interlude in comparison to the long period of oppressive and intense atmosphere that followed, and it became merely another topic for gossip during leisure time. The competition between Yi Shiwen and the Twin Stars brothers was about to take place in this tense atmosphere. To be continued.